The Pumpkin Giant by Mary Wilkins Freeman in the Topaz Storybook. A very long time ago, before our grandmother's time, or our great-grandmother's, or our grandmother's with a very long string of greats prefixed, there were no pumpkins. People had never eaten a pumpkin pie or even stewed pumpkin. That was the time when the pumpkin giant flourished. There have been many great giants who have flourished since the world began, and although a select few of them have been good giants, the majority of them have been so bad that their crimes, even more than their size, have gone on to make them notorious. But the pumpkin giant was an uncommonly bad one, and his general appearance and his behaviour were such as to make one shudder to an extent that you would hardly believe possible. The convulsive shivering caused by the mere mention of his name, and, in some cases where the people were unusually sensitive, by the mere thought of him even, more resembled the blue ague than anything else. Indeed, was known by the name of the giant's shakes. The pumpkin giant was very tall. He probably would have overtopped most of the giants you have ever heard of. I don't suppose the giant who lived on the beanstalk, whom Jack visited, was anything to compare with him, nor that it would have been a possible thing for the pumpkin giant, had he received an invitation to spend an afternoon with the beanstalk giant, to accept on account of his inability to enter the beanstalk giant's door, no matter how much he stooped. The pumpkin giant had a very large yellow head, which was also smooth and shiny. His eyes were big and round, and glowed like coals of fire, and you would almost have thought that his head was lit up inside with candles. Indeed, there was a rumour to that effect amongst the common people, but that it was all nonsense, of course. No one of the more enlightened class credited it for an instant. His mouth, which stretched half around his head, was furnished with rows of pointed teeth, and he was never known to hold it any other way than wide open. The pumpkin giant lived in a castle, as a matter of course. It is not fashionable for a giant to live in any other kind of a dwelling. Why, nothing would be more tame and uninteresting than a giant in a 2-story white house with green blinds and a picket fence, or even a brownstone front, if he could get into either of them, which he could not. The giant's castle was situated on a mountain, as it ought to have been, and there was also the usual courtyard before it, and the customary moat, which was full of bones. All I've got to say about these bones is, they were not mutton bones. A great many details of this story must be left to the imagination of the reader. They are too harrowing to relate. A much tenderer regard for the feelings of the audience will be shown in this than in most giant stories. We will even go so far as to state in advance that the story has a good end, thereby enabling readers to peruse it comfortably without unpleasant suspense. The pumpkin giant was fonder of little boys and girls than anything else in the world, and particularly of fat little children. The fear and horror of this giant extended over the whole country. Even the king on his throne was so severely afflicted with the giant's shakes that he had been obliged to have the throne propped for fear it should topple over in some unusually violent fit. There was a good reason why the king shook. His only daughter, the Princess Ariadne Diana, was probably the fattest princess in the whole world at that date. So fat was she that she had never walked a step in the dozen years of her life, being totally unable to progress over the earth by any method except rolling. And a really beautiful sight it was, too, to see the Princess Ariadne Diana in her cloth of gold rolling suit, faced with green velvet and edged with ermine, with her glittering crown on her head, trundling along the avenues of the royal gardens, which had been furnished with strips of rich carpeting for her express accommodation. But gratifying as it would have been to the king, her sire, under other circumstances, to have had such an unusually interesting daughter, it now only served to fill his heart with the greatest anxiety on her account. The princess was never allowed to leave the palace without a bodyguard of 50 knights, the very flower of the king's troops, with lances in rest, but in spite of all this precaution, the king shook. Meanwhile, amongst the ordinary people, who could not procure an escort of 50 armed knights for the plump among their children, the ravages of the pumpkin giant were frightful. It was apprehended at one time that there would be very few fat little girls, and no fat little boys at all, left in the kingdom. And what made matters worse, at that time the giant commenced taking a tonic to increase his appetite. Finally, the king, in desperation, issued a proclamation that he would knight anyone, be he noble or common, who should cut off the head of the pumpkin giant. This was the king's usual method of rewarding any noble deed in his kingdom. It was a cheap method, and besides, everybody liked to be a knight. When the king issued his proclamation, every man in the kingdom who was not already a knight straightway tried to contrive ways and means to kill the pumpkin giant. But there was one obstacle which seemed insurmountable. They were afraid, and all of them had the giant's shakes so bad that they could not possibly have held a knife steady enough to cut off the giant's head, even if they had dared to go near enough for that purpose. There was one man who lived not far from the terrible giant's castle, a poor man, his only worldly wealth consisting of a large potato field and a cottage in front of it. But he had a boy of 12, an only son, who rivalled the Princess Ariadne Diana in a point of fatness. He was unable to have a bodyguard for his son, so the amount of terror which the inhabitants of that humble cottage suffered day and night was heartrending. The poor mother had been unable to leave her bed for 2 years on account of the giant's shakes. Her husband barely got a living from the potato field. Half the time he and his wife had hardly enough to eat, as it naturally took the larger part of the potatoes to satisfy the fat little boy, their son, and their situation was truly pitiable. The fat boy's name was Aeneas, his father's name was Patroclus, and his mother's Daphne. It was all the fashion in those days to have classical names, and as that was the fashion as easily adopted by the poor as the rich, everybody had them. They were just like Jim and Tommy and May in these days. Why, the princess's name, Ariadne Diana, was nothing more nor less than Anne Eliza with us. One morning, Patroclus and Aeneas were out in the field digging potatoes, for new potatoes were just in the market. The early rose potato had not been discovered in those days, but there was another potato, perhaps equally good, which attained a similar degree of celebrity. It was called the young Plantagenet, and reached a very large size indeed, much larger than the early rose does in our time. Well, Patroclus and Aeneas had just dug perhaps a bushel of young Plantagenet potatoes. It was slow work with them, for Patroclus had the giant's shakes badly that morning, and of course Aeneas was not very swift. He rolled about among the potato hills after the manner of the Princess Ariadne Diana, but he did not present as imposing an appearance as she, in his homespun farmer's frock. All at once the earth trembled violently. Patroclus and Aeneas looked up and saw the pumpkin giant coming with his mouth wide open. "Get behind me, oh my darling son!" cried Patroclus. Aeneas obeyed, but it was of no use, for you could see his cheeks on each side of his father's waistcoat. Patroclus was not ordinarily a brave man, but he was brave in an emergency, and as that is the only time when there is the slightest need of bravery, it was just as well. The pumpkin giant strode along faster and faster, opening his mouth wider and wider until they could fairly hear it crack at the corners. Then Patroclus picked up an enormous young Plantagenet and threw it plump into the pumpkin giant's mouth. The giant choked and gasped, and and finally tumbled down and died. Patroclus and Aeneas, while the giant was choking, had run to the house and locked themselves in. Then they looked out of the window. When they saw the giant tumble down and lie quite still, they knew he must be dead. Then Daphne was immediately cured of the giant's shakes and got out of bed for the first time in 2 years. Patroclus sharpened the carving knife on the kitchen stove, and they all went out into the potato field. They cautiously approached the prostrate giant, for fear he might be shamming and might suddenly spring up at them, and Aeneas too. But no, he did not move at all. He was quite dead. And all taking turns, they hacked off his head with the carving knife. Then Aeneas had it to play with, which was quite appropriate and a good instance of the sarcasm of destiny. The king was notified of the death of the pumpkin giant and was greatly rejoiced thereby. His giant's shakes ceased, the props were removed from the throne, and the Princess Ariadne Diana was allowed to go out without her bodyguard of 50 knights, much to her delight, for she found them a great hindrance to the enjoyment of her daily outings. It was a great cross, not to say an embarrassment, when she was gleefully rolling in pursuit of a charming red and gold butterfly to find herself suddenly stopped short by an armed knight with his lance in rest. But the king, though his gratitude for the noble deed knew no bounds, omitted to give the promised reward and knight Patroclus. I hardly know how it happened. I don't think it was anything intentional. Patroclus felt rather hurt about it, and Daphne would have liked to have been a lady, but Aeneas did not care in the least. He had the giant's head to play with, and that was reward enough for him. There was not a boy in the neighbourhood but envied him of his possession of such a unique plaything, and when they would stand looking over the wall of the potato field with longing eyes, and he was flying over the ground with the head, his happiness knew no bounds, and Aeneas played so much with the giant's head that finally, late in the fall, it got broken and scattered all over the field. Next spring, all over Patroclus's potato field grew running vines, and in the fall, giants' heads. There they were all over the field, hundreds of them. Then there was consternation indeed, the natural conclusion to be arrived at when the people saw the yellow giants' heads making their appearance above the ground was that the rest of the giants were coming. There was one pumpkin giant before, said they, now there will be a whole army of them. If it was dreadful then, what will it be in future? If one pumpkin giant gave us the shakes so badly, what will a whole army of them do? But when some time had elapsed and nothing more of the giants appeared above the surface of the potato field, and as moreover the heads had not yet displayed any sign of opening their mouths, the people began to feel a little easier, and the general excitement subsided somewhat, although the king had ordered out Ariadne Diana's bodyguard again. Now Aeneas had been born with a propensity for putting everything into his mouth and tasting it. There was scarcely anything in his vicinity which could by any possibility be tasted which he had not eaten a bit of. This propensity was so alarming in his babyhood that Daphne purchased a book of antidotes, and if it had not been for her admirable good judgment in doing so, this story would probably have never been told, for no human baby could possibly have survived the heterogeneous diet which Aeneas had indulged in. There was scarcely one of the antidotes which had not been resorted to from time to time. Aeneas had become acquainted with the peculiar flavour of almost everything in his immediate vicinity except the giants' heads, and he naturally enough cast longing eyes at them. Night and day he wondered what a giant's head could taste like, till finally one day, when Patroclus was away, he stole out into the potato field, cut a bit out of one of the giant's heads and ate it. He was almost afraid to, but he reflected that his mother could give him an antidote, so he ventured. It tasted very sweet and nice. He liked it so much that he cut off another piece and ate that, and then another and another, until he had eaten 2/3 of a giant's head. Then he thought it was about time for him to go in and tell his mother and take an antidote, though he did not feel ill at all yet. "Mother," he said, rolling slowly into the cottage, "I have eaten 2/3 of a giant's head, and I guess you better give me an antidote." "Oh, my precious son," cried Daphne, "how could you?" She looked in her book of antidotes, but could not find one antidote for a giant's head. "Oh, Aeneas, my dear, dear son," groaned Daphne, "there is no antidote for giant's head. What shall we do?" Then she sat down and wept, and Aeneas wept too, as loud as he possibly could. And he apparently had good reason to, for it did not seem possible that a boy could eat 2/3 of a giant's head and survive it without an antidote. Patroclus came home and they told him, and he sat down and lamented with them. All day they sat weeping and watching Aeneas, expecting every moment to see him die. But he did not die. On the contrary, he had never felt so well in his life. Finally, at sunset, Aeneas looked up and laughed. "I'm not going to die," he said. "I've never felt so well. You'd better stop crying. And I'm going out to get some more of that giant's head. I am hungry." Don't," cried his father and mother. But he went, for he generally took his own way, very like most only sons. He came back with a whole giant's head in his arms. "See here, father and mother," cried he. "We'll all have some of this. It is evidently not poison, and it is good, a great deal better than potatoes." Patroclus and Daphne hesitated, but they were hungry too. Since the crop of giant's head had sprung up in their field instead of potatoes, they had been hungry most of the time, so they tasted. "It is good," said Daphne, "but I think it would be better cooked." So she put some in a kettle of water over the fire and let it boil a while, and then she dished it up, and they all ate it. It was delicious. It tasted more like stewed pumpkin than anything else. In fact, it was stewed pumpkin. Daphne was inventive and something of a genius, and the next day she concocted another dish out of the giant's heads. She boiled them and sifted them and mixed them with eggs and sugar and milk and spice. Then she lined some plates with puff paste, filled them with the mixture, and set them in the oven to bake. The result was unparalleled. Nothing half so exquisite had ever been tasted. They were all in ecstasies, Aeneas in particular. They gathered all of the giant's heads and stored them in the cellar. Daphne baked pies of them every day, and nothing could surpass the felicity of the whole family. One morning the king had been out hunting and happened to ride by the cottage of Patroclus with a train of his knights. Daphne was baking pies as usual, and the kitchen door and window were both open, for the room was so warm, so the delicious odour of the pies perfumed the whole air about the cottage. "What is it smells so utterly lovely?" exclaimed the king, sniffing in rapture. He sent his page in to see. "The housewife is baking giant's head pies," said the page, returning. "What?" thundered the king. "Bring one out to me." So the page brought out a pie to him, and after all his knights had tasted to be sure it wasn't poison, and the king had watched them sharply for a few moments to be sure they were not killed, he tasted too. Then he beamed. It was a new sensation, and a new sensation is a great boon to a king. "I never tasted anything so altogether superfine, so utterly magnificent in my life," cried the king. "Stewed peacock's tongues from the Baltic are not to be compared with it. Call out the housewife immediately." So Daphne came out trembling, and Patroclus, and Aeneas also. "What a charming lad!" exclaimed the king, as his glance fell upon Aeneas. "Now tell me about these wonderful pies, and I will reward you as becomes a monarch." Then Patroclus fell on his knees and related the whole story of the giant's head pies from the beginning. The king actually blushed. "And I forgot to knight you, O noble and brave man, and to make a lady of your admirable wife." Then the king leaned gracefully down from his saddle and struck Patroclus with his jewelled sword and knighted him on the spot. The whole family went to live at the royal palace. The roses in the royal gardens were uprooted, and giants' heads, or pumpkins as they came to be called, were sown in their stead. All the royal parks were also turned into pumpkin fields. Patroclus was in constant attendance upon the king and used to stand all day in his antechamber. Daphne had a position of great responsibility, for she superintended the baking of the pumpkin pies, and Aeneas finally married the Princess Ariadne Diana. They were wedded in great state by 50 archbishops, and all the newspapers united in stating that they were the most charming and well-matched young couple that had ever been united in the kingdom. The stone entrance of the pumpkin giant's castle was securely fastened, and upon it was engraved an inscription composed by the first poet in the kingdom, for which the king made him laureate and gave him the liberal pension of 50 pumpkin pies per year. The end. The Selfish Giant by Oscar Wilde. Every afternoon, as they were coming from school, the children used to go and play in the giant's garden. It was a large, lovely garden with soft green grass. Here and there over the grass stood beautiful flowers like stars, and there were 12 peach trees that in the springtime broke out into delicate blossoms of pink and pearl, and in the autumn bore rich fruit. The birds sat on the trees and sang so sweetly that the children used to stop their games in order to listen to them. "How happy we are here," they cried to each other. One day the giant came back. He had been to visit his friend the Cornish ogre and had stayed with him for 7 years. After the 7 years were over, he had said all that he had to say, for his conversation was limited, and he determined to return to his own castle. When he arrived, he saw the children playing in the garden. "What are you doing here?" he cried in a very gruff voice, and the children ran away. "My own garden is my own garden," said the giant. "No one can understand that, and I will allow nobody to play in it but myself." So he built a high wall all around it and put up a notice board: "Trespassers will be prosecuted." He was a very selfish giant. The poor children had now nowhere to play. They tried to play on the road, but the road was very dusty and full of hard stones, and they did not like it. They used to wander around the high wall when their lessons were over and talk about the beautiful garden inside. How happy we were there, they said to each other. Then the spring came, and all over the country there were little blossoms and little birds. Only in the garden of the selfish giant it was still winter. The birds did not care to sing in it, as there were no children, and the trees forgot to blossom. Once a beautiful flower put its head out from the grass, but when it saw the notice board, it was so sorry for the children that it slipped back into the ground again and went off to sleep. The only people who were pleased were the snow and the frost. "Spring has forgotten this garden," they cried, "so we will live here all year round." The snow covered up the grass with her great white cloak, and the frost painted all the trees silver. Then they invited the north wind to stay with them, and he came. He was wrapped in furs, and he roared all day about the garden and blew the chimney pots down. "This is a delightful spot," he said. "We must ask the hail on a visit." So the hail came. Every day for 3 hours he rattled on the roof of the castle till he broke most of the slates, and then he ran round and round the garden as fast as he could go. He was dressed in grey, and his breath was like ice. "I cannot understand why the spring is so late in coming," said the selfish giant, as he sat at the window and looked out at his cold white garden. "I hope there will be a change in the weather." But the spring never came, nor the summer. The autumn gave golden fruit to every garden, but to the giant's garden she gave none. "He is too selfish," she said. So it was always winter there, and the north wind and the hail and the frost and the snow danced about through the trees. One morning the giant was lying awake in bed when he heard some lovely music. It sounded so sweet to his ears that he thought it must be the king's musicians passing by. It was really only a little linnet singing outside his window, but it was so long since he had heard a bird sing in his garden that it seemed to him to be the most beautiful music in the world. Then the hail stopped dancing over his head, and the north wind ceased roaring, and a delicious perfume came to him through the open casement. "I believe the spring has come at last," said the giant, and he jumped out of bed and looked out. What did he see? He saw a most wonderful sight. Through a little hole in the wall the children had crept in, and they were sitting in the branches of the trees. In every tree that he could see there was a little child, and the trees were so glad to have the children back again that they had covered themselves with blossoms and were waving their arms gently above the children's heads. The birds were flying about and twittering with delight, and the flowers were looking up through the green grass and laughing. It was a lovely scene, only in one corner it was still winter. It was the farthest corner of the garden, and in it was standing a little boy. He was so small that he could not reach up to the branches of the tree, and he was wandering all around it, crying bitterly. The poor tree was still quite covered with frost and snow, and the north wind was blowing and roaring above it. "Climb up, little boy," said the tree, and it bent its branches down as low as it could, but the boy was too tiny. And the giant's heart melted as he looked out. "How selfish I have been," he said. "Now I know why the spring would not come here. I will put that poor little boy on the top of the tree, and then I will knock down the wall, and my garden shall be the children's playground for ever and ever." He was really very sorry for what he had done. So he crept downwards and opened the front door quite softly and went out into the garden. But when the children saw him, they were so frightened that they all ran away, and the garden became winter again. Only the little boy did not run, for his eyes were so full of tears that he did not see the giant coming. And the giant stole up behind him and took him gently in his hand and put him into the tree. And the tree broke at once into blossom, and the birds came and sang on it, and the little boy stretched out his 2 arms and flung them around the giant's neck and kissed him. And the other children, when they saw that the giant was not wicked any longer, came running back, and with them came the spring. "It is your garden now, little children," said the giant, and he took a great axe and knocked down the wall. And when the people were going to market at 12 o'clock, they found the giant playing with the children in the most beautiful garden they had ever seen. All day long they played, and in the evening they came to the giant to bid him goodbye. "But where is your little companion?" he said, "the boy I put into the tree." The giant loved him best because he kissed him. "We don't know," answered the children. "He has gone away." "You must tell him to be sure and come here tomorrow," said the giant. But the children said that they did not know where he lived and had never seen him before, and the giant felt very sad. Every afternoon, when school was over, the children came and played with the giant. But the little boy whom the giant loved was never seen again. The giant was very kind to all the children, yet he longed for his first little friend and often spoke of him. "How I would like to see him," he used to say. Years went over, and the giant grew very old and feeble. He could not play about any more, so he sat in a huge armchair and watched the children at their games and admired his garden. "I have many beautiful flowers," he said, "but the children are the most beautiful flowers of all." One winter morning he looked out of his window as he was dressing. He did not hate the winter now, for he knew that it was merely the spring asleep and that the flowers were resting. Suddenly he rubbed his eyes in wonder and looked and looked. It certainly was a marvellous sight. In the farthest corner of the garden was a tree quite covered with lovely white blossoms. Its branches were all golden, and silver fruit hung down from them, and underneath it stood the little boy he had loved. Downstairs ran the giant in great joy and out into the garden. He hastened across the grass and came near to the child. And when he came quite close, his face grew red with anger, and he said, "Who hath dared to wound thee?" For on the palms of the child's hand were the prints of 2 nails, and the prints of 2 nails were on the little feet. "Who hath dared to wound thee?" cried the giant. "Tell me that I may take my big sword and slay him." "Nay," answered the child, "but these are the wounds of love." "Who art thou?" said the giant, and a strange awe fell on him, and he knelt before the little child. And the child smiled on the giant and said to him, "You let me play once in your garden. Today you shall come with me to my garden, which is paradise." And when the children ran in that afternoon, they found the giant lying dead under the tree, all covered with white blossoms. The end. Circus School by Andrea Kaczmarek. Circus Tortellini isn't an ordinary circus. Circus Tortellini travels from town to town with a clever circus school. Circus Tortellini visits schools and puts up its bright big top right next to a school, and then the fun begins. Franco Tortellini is the ringmaster, and he knows that all children love a circus and can learn lots and lots. "Children learn special things at our circus school," Franco laughs. When Circus Tortellini is ready, they begin with a show full of excitement. The children, teachers, parents, grandparents, and friends are all invited. Franco Tortellini booms, "Welcome to the amazing Circus Tortellini." There are clowns, jugglers, acrobats, tightrope walkers, ponies, trapeze artists, strongmen, a magic show, unicycles, trampolines, and popcorn. Leon, Mia, Emma, and Noah just can't stop clapping as they watch the show. "I'm going to be the ringmaster. I'll be amazing," Leon laughs. "I want to balance on the ponies in a pink tutu," Mia beams. "I shall juggle 10 flashing balls," Noah hoops. "And I shall walk a tightrope high above your heads," Emma points up high to the trapeze. At the end of the show, with the wonderful costumes, fun, and plenty of scares, Franco Tortellini and his family take a bow, and Franco booms, "Goodbye, children. See you on Monday morning, bright and ready for circus school." And that's what happens. For the next week, there is no classroom, just the big top, and the children learn Project Circus. For the 4 friends, Leon, Mia, Noah, and Emma, things turn out different to what they expect. Franco Tortellini and his family, Gina, Francesca, Pepito, and Angelo, with the other circus artists, divide the children into groups in the schoolyard, and they throw balls, do skipping, roll out the mats, and jump around. "Let's see what you are good at." Franco and Angela just walk, talk, play, and mess around. The children do lots of different things. They balance on wobbly planks, they climb up ropes, they bounce on trampolines, laughing, and at the end of the day, they rub their aching legs and arms. The next day, all the children are put into their circus school groups. Franco laughs his very loud laughs and tells them, "We watched you all day yesterday, and we think we've found the very best groups for you all." "I'm a clown, I always knew it," Leon shakes his head. "I'm in the juggling and hula hoop team." Mia is happy. "But I've got ponies and popcorn." Emma smiles. Noah scratches his head. Unicycles, whatever that is, and selling programs and showing people to their seats. They all laugh, not sure what to expect. Don't let anybody ever tell you circus is easy. At break time they fall onto a bench, rubbing their aching legs. Well, how many balls can you juggle? Leon turns to Mia. Well, we didn't start with balls at all. We started off with bright floaty scarves. We start on balls this afternoon. Ah, the others shrug. Unicycles are wobbly, Noah joins in. We spent the morning learning how to get on and off and wobble around. Well, clowns are the most important circus acts, Leon tells his friends. They make people laugh, but they help in between to put things up or take them down. This afternoon we're going to learn to trampoline. Mia laughed. Trampoline is easy. You try it with great big floppy boots on. Leon looked at her. And my clown name is Loopy. Clowns have clown names and their own special makeup. Every day the friends practiced in their groups. Now they are starting to feel a bit nervous, and their big circus day is at the end of the week. Have you got your costumes? Emma joins them. We've got our pink tutus and tights today. Mrs. Tortellini is cool. She does the costumes. Leon has the most to do. The clowns always do, as he keeps telling them how important the clowns are. Yes, Loopy, the world's greatest clown. Ha, ha, ha. They all laugh. At last it is the day of the grand circus show. Leon, or Loopy, runs around with a bucket filled with confetti, but the head clown has a bucket filled with water, just to make the audience nervous. Leon hands out umbrellas to make them more nervous. Even his mum doesn't know Leon under the great big orange wig and baggy patchwork pants. Leon is now Loopy. The clowns then do bell ringing, noisy and out of tune, but then they stop, shake their heads and play a proper tune. They also do their clown trampoline act, crazy bouncing in big boots. Emma balances with outstretched arms on her pony. Later, Emma slips out of her pink tutu and into her red circus t-shirt to sell popcorn in the break. The people are happy. Lovely show, those children are so good. Noah first shows the audience to their seats wearing a red t-shirt and trying to be helpful. Later, he changes into his sparkling jacket and silver hat for the unicycle show. Then he starts to feel nervous. Twisting, turning and weaving around, all on one wheel, not so easy, but the group manage well. The music helps and they even cycle up and down ramps. Noah laughs as he remembers his first wobbles. Mia's act is juggling. All the jugglers wear bright baggy rainbow costumes and juggle with balls, rings and do plate spinning. At the end they throw up the rainbow scarves. The bright coloured scarves float down and everything is magical. If you drop one, you just laugh. It's all part of the act, Gino always tells them. Later, the jugglers leave the ring, but they quickly slip off the costumes. They have black clothes underneath. Then they slip on a black mask. When they are all ready, they run back into the ring with all the lights switched off. Now they have hula hoops that shine orange, pink, green and yellow in the dark. Mia feels so good. It's magical. It's showtime. She smiles and twists her yellow hoop to join the pattern of the others. Their friends can't believe it. The circus show is a huge success. But now, sadly, it's the end of the show. They all troop out back into the circus ring. Franco, in his red coat and top hat, tells them to take the biggest and lowest bow, and Franco's voice booms loud. Just 1 week, learning new things, these children are the real stars. The clowns, the jugglers, the balancers, the cyclists, the tightrope walkers, the acrobats and dancers all take a big bow. Leon, Mia, Noah and Emma have had the very best circus week and can't wait until Circus Tortellini is back in town again. Next time I'll be a clown too, Noah tells Leon. You can wobble and fall off a unicycle. They all laugh. Who would have believed it? Mia now in her normal clothes. We had so much fun, but my bones are aching and bruised. But I've got a brilliant idea. They all looked at her. Let's meet in my garden with the trampoline and practice our very own circus. I can teach you juggling, Mia laughs. And I can teach you about big boot bouncing, Loopy Leon laughs too. And we can call it Circus Pepperoni, Noah joined in. Circus Pepperoni? The others looked puzzled. Yes, because I love hot pepperoni on my pizza. The end. Princess Robin and the Dragon by Rachel Grosvenor. Once upon a time, not so long ago, there lived a brave girl called Robin. Robin was a princess and lived in a castle in the village of Whitsworth with her parents, who who were king and queen but rarely used their royal titles, her brother, Prince Noah, and Nacho, her best friend and ginger cat sidekick. One morning, Princess Robin was helping Nacho with his breakfast. "Would you like biscuits, Nacho?" Nacho meowed loudly, meaning yes, and wrapped himself around Robin's legs. Breakfast was Nacho's favourite meal of the day, and by coincidence, it was also Robin's. As Robin poured the biscuits into Nacho's fish-shaped dish, she caught a whiff of them. They smelled delicious. She licked her lips and reached for one of them, but Nacho nudged her with his paw and meowed again. Robin glanced at him. He was right. They were his snacks, and Nacho never took her food. "Okay, Nacho, here you go," she said brightly, and watched Nacho tuck into his tasty meal. Once they had both eaten, it was time to get dressed. Nacho sat beside Robin as she chose her outfit for the day. They had big plans. First, they were going to go to the park and ride on the slide, and then they were going to stop by the local stables to feed the horses some carrots. Just as Robin reached for a pair of mustard leggings, she heard a huge roar. The castle shook a little, and Nacho ran and hid under the bed. Princess Robin frowned and pulled on her leggings, then marched to the window to look out. What on earth was that noise? Immediately she saw the culprit. There, in the misty morning sun, sat a dragon, overlooking the village. He roared again, and the townspeople scattered into their houses, hiding. Robin put her hands on her hips and frowned. A dragon would ruin all of her plans for the day. She had been so looking forward to seeing the horses at the stables. This would not do. "Nacho, are you going to come and talk to this dragon with me?" Nacho let out a short, sharp meow that sounded very much like a no. "Okay," said Princess Robin, nodding. "I can see that you're scared. I'm scared too, but I'm not going to let a dragon ruin everyone's day." Robin pulled on her boots and walked out of her room, through the castle and out the front door. As soon as she stepped outside, she felt the hot breath of the dragon on her skin. There he was, roaring loudly into the sky, the noise shaking the windows of all the houses. There was absolutely nobody to be seen. Everyone was hiding, apart from Princess Robin. "Excuse me," Robin shouted, walking towards the dragon with purpose. He stopped mid-roar and stared at her in surprise. "Are you talking to me?" he said, glancing around him. "Yes," said Princess Robin crossly. "Why are you making such a noise? You've frightened everyone away." The dragon blinked at her and then looked around him at the village. Then Robin noticed something different about the dragon. He was crying. A long wet tear dropped from the corner of his eye and landed in a huge puddle beneath him. Robin stepped closer to him. "Are you okay?" she asked. The dragon sniffed loudly and shook his gigantic scaly head. "No, I didn't get any sleep last night. I have a terrible toothache, and I was hoping that someone in the village might be able to help me, but everyone is afraid of me, except you." Robin smiled kindly. "Well, that's just because of the noise you were making. I can organize a dentist to help you, but you must understand that people don't like big noises." The dragon sniffed again and nodded sadly. "I understand. Thank you for being smart enough to see that I was only in pain and brave enough to come and talk to me." Robin nodded and strode over to the dragon, patting him on one of his large toes. "Don't worry, we'll fetch some ladders and the dentist, and you'll be back to your usual self in no time at all." Princess Robin did just that. She visited all the local hardware shops and encouraged the owners to come out with their ladders. Then she visited the dentist and asked for help with the dragon's tooth. The townspeople were very nervous at first, but Robin explained to them kindly that the dragon was only grumpy because he was in pain and that everyone needed help sometimes, regardless of size. The townspeople listened to her and pulled back their shoulders, doing their best to be as brave as the princess. Together, they encouraged the dragon to lie down. Once the ladders were secured, the dentist was able to climb up them and hop into the dragon's mouth to see what the problem was. It was a large piece of hedge stuck between two of his teeth. The dentist popped her head out of the dragon's mouth and shrugged. "I'm afraid that I don't have any equipment big enough to remove this," she said. Robin thought for a moment and then had a bright idea. "Somebody fetch the fire service. They have hoses that are big and powerful, and they'll have no problem spraying the hedge out of the dragon's teeth." Princess Robin was quite right, and the hose did just the trick. Once the hedge had been removed and everyone was back on the ground, the dragon sat up and purred with delight. His purr sounded just like Nacho's. "Thank you so much, Princess Robin," said the dragon in relief. "I can't tell you what a difference you've made. The village of Whitsworth is lucky to have a princess as thoughtful, brave, and smart as you." Robin smiled. She was just relieved that the dragon was feeling better and that the townspeople were able to go on enjoying their day. And that, of course, included her. Now she could visit the horses in the stable yard and feed them carrots for dinner. The end. The Ratcatcher by Andrew Lang. A very long time ago, the town of Hamel in Germany was invaded by bands of rats, the like of which had never been seen before, nor will ever be again. They were great black creatures that ran boldly in broad daylight through the streets, and swarmed so all over the houses that people at last could not put their hand or foot down anywhere without touching one. When dressing in the morning, they found them in their breeches and petticoats, in their pockets and their boots, and when they wanted a morsel to eat, the voracious horde had swept away everything from cellar to garret. The night was even worse. As soon as the lights were out, these untiring nibblers set to work, and everywhere, in the ceilings, in the floors, in the cupboards, at the doors, there was a chase and a rummage, and so furious a noise of gimlets, pincers, and saws that a deaf man could not have rested for 1 hour together. Neither cats nor dogs, nor poison nor traps, nor prayers nor candles burnt all to the saints. Nothing would do anything. The more they killed, the more came. And the inhabitants of Hamel began to go to the dogs, not that they were of much use, when one Friday there arrived in town a man with a queer face, who played the bagpipes and sang this refrain: "Qui vivra verra, le voilà, le preneur de rats." He was a great gawky fellow, dry and bronzed, with a crooked nose, a long rat-tail moustache, 2 great yellow piercing and mocking eyes, under a large felt hat set off by a scarlet cock's feather. He was dressed in a green jacket with a leather belt and red breeches, and on his feet were sandals fastened by thongs passed round his legs in the gypsy fashion. That is how he may be seen to this day, painted on a window of the Cathedral of Hamel. He stopped on the great market-place before the town hall, turned his back on the church, and went on with his music, singing, "Who lives shall see, this is he, the rat-catcher." The town council had just assembled to consider once more this plague of Egypt, from which no one could save the town. The stranger sent word to the councillors that, if they would make it worth his while, he would rid them of all their rats before night, down to the very last. "Then he is a sorcerer," cried the citizens with one voice. "We must beware of him." The town councillor, who was considered clever, reassured them. He said, "Sorcerer or no, if this bagpiper speaks the truth, it was he who sent us this horrible vermin that he wants to rid us of today for money. Well, we must learn to catch the devil in his own snares. You leave it to me." "Leave it to the town councillor," said the citizens to one another, and the stranger was brought before them. "Before night," said he, "I shall have dispatched all the rats in Hamel, if you will but pay me a gros a head." "A gros a head?" cried the citizens, "but that will come to millions of florins." The town councillor simply shrugged his shoulders and said to the stranger, "A bargain. To work, the rats will be paid 1 gros a head as you ask." The bagpiper announced that he would operate that very evening when the moon rose. He added that the inhabitants should at that hour leave the streets free and content themselves with looking out of their windows at what was passing, and that it would be a pleasant spectacle. When the people of Hamel heard of the bargain, they too exclaimed, "A gros a head? But this will cost us a great deal of money." "Leave it to the town councillor," said the town council with a malicious air, and the good people of Hamel repeated with their councillors, "Leave it to the town councillor." Towards 9 at night, the bagpiper reappeared on the marketplace. He turned, as at first, his back to the church, and the moment the moon rose on the horizon, tra-ri-ra, tra-ri, the bagpipes sounded. It was first a slow, caressing sound, then more and more lively and urgent, and so sonorous and piercing that it penetrated as far as the farthest alleys and retreats of the town. Soon from the bottom of the cellars, the tops of the garrets, from under all the furniture, from all the nooks and corners of the houses, out come the rats, search for the door, fling themselves into the street, and trip, 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 began to run in file towards the front of the town hall, so squeezed together that they covered the pavement like the waves of flooded torrent. When the square was quite full, the bagpiper faced about, and still playing briskly, turns towards the river that runs at the foot of the walls of Hamel. Arrived there, he turned round. The rats were following. "Hop, hop," he cried, pointing with his finger to the middle of the stream, where the water whirled and was drawn down as if through a funnel. And hop, hop, without hesitating, the rats took the leap, swam straight to the funnel, plunged in head foremost, and disappeared. The plunging continued thus without ceasing till midnight. At last, dragging himself with difficulty, came a big rat, white with age, and stopped on the bank. It was the king of the band. "Are they all there, friend Blanchet?" asked the bagpiper. "They are all there," replied friend Blanchet. "And how many were there?" 990,999. "Well reckoned?" "Well reckoned." "Then go and join them, old sire, and au revoir." Then the old white rat sprang in his turn into the river, swam to the whirlpool, and disappeared. When the bagpiper had thus concluded his business, he went to bed at his inn, and for the first time during 3 months the people of Hamel slept quietly through the night. The next morning, at 9 o'clock, the bagpiper repaired to the town hall, where the town council awaited him. "All your rats took a jump into the river yesterday," said he to the councillors, "and I guarantee that not one of them comes back. There were 990,999 at 1 gros a head. Reckon." "Let us reckon the heads first. 1 gros a head is 1 head the gros. Where are the heads?" The rat-catcher did not expect this treacherous stroke. He paled with anger, and his eyes flashed fire. "The heads?" cried he. "If you care about them, go and find them in the river." "So," replied the town councillor, "you refuse to hold the terms of your agreement? We ourselves could refuse you all payment. But you have been of use to us, and we will not let you go without a recompense." And he offered him 50 crowns. "Keep your recompense for yourself," replied the rat-catcher proudly. "If you do not pay me, I will be paid by your heirs." Thereupon he pulled his hat down over his eyes, went hastily out of the hall, and left the town without speaking to a soul. When the Hamel people heard how the affair had ended, they rubbed their hands, and with no more scruple than their town councillor, they laughed over the rat-catcher, who, they said, was caught in his own trap. But what made them laugh above all was his threat of getting himself paid by their heirs. Ha! They wished only that they had such creditors for the rest of their lives. Next day, which was a Sunday, they all went gaily to church, thinking that after Mass they would at last be able to eat some good thing that the rats had not tasted before them. They never suspected the terrible surprise that awaited them on their return home. No children anywhere. They had all disappeared. "Our children! Where are our poor children?" was the cry that was soon heard in all the streets. Then through the east door of the town came 3 little boys, who cried and wept, and this is what they told. While the parents were at church, a wonderful music had resounded. Soon all the little boys and all the little girls that had been left at home had gone out, attracted by the magic sounds, and had rushed to the great marketplace. There they found the rat-catcher playing his bagpipes at the same spot as the evening before. Then the stranger had begun to walk quickly, and they had followed, running, singing and dancing to the sound of the music, as far as the foot of the mountain, which one sees on entering Hamel. At their approach, the mountain had opened a little, and the bagpiper had gone in with them, after which it had closed again. Only the 3 little ones who told the adventure had remained outside, as if by a miracle. One was a bandy-legged and could not run fast enough. The other, who had left the house in haste, 1 foot shod, the other bare, had hurt himself against a big stone and could not walk without difficulty. The third had arrived in time, but in hurrying to go with the others had struck so violently against the wall of the mountain that he fell backwards at the moment it closed upon his comrades. At this story the parents redoubled their lamentations. They ran with pikes and mattocks to the mountain, and searched till evening to find the opening by which their children had disappeared, without being able to find it. At last, the night falling, they returned desolate to Hamel. But the most unhappy of all was the town councillor, for he lost 3 little boys and 2 pretty little girls, and to crown all, the people of Hamel overwhelmed him with reproaches, forgetting that the evening before they had all agreed with him. What had become of all these unfortunate children? The parents always hoped they were not dead, and that the rat-catcher, who certainly must have come out of the mountain, would have taken them with him to his country. That is why for several years they sent in search of them to different countries, but no one ever came on the trace of the poor little ones. It was not till much later that anything was to be heard of them. About 150 years after the event, when there was no longer one left of the fathers, mothers, brothers or sisters of that day, there arrived one evening in Hamel some merchants of Bremen returning from the east, who asked to speak with the citizens. They told that they, in crossing Hungary, had sojourned in a mountainous country called Transylvania, where the inhabitants spoke only German, while all around them nothing was spoken but Hungarian. These people also declared that they came from Germany, but they did not know how they chanced to be in this strange country. Now, said the merchants of Bremen, these Germans cannot be other than the descendants of the lost children of Hamel. The people of Hamel did not doubt it, and since that day they regarded as certain that the Transylvanians of Hungary are their country folk, whose ancestors, as children, were brought there by the rat-catcher. There are more difficult things to believe than that. The end. The Knight and the Griffin by Glenn Francis F. Failnar. Once a year, Frank and his family travelled to San Francisco. They visited a house where an old man named Rupert and his wife Elaine lived. His family had been doing this since even before Frank was born. He didn't mind it, though. He loved visiting Rupert and Elaine. He enjoyed being there. After his first time visiting, he couldn't wait to visit them again. He could tell that his mum and dad enjoyed it too. When they arrived, Rupert sat by the porch, rocking back and forth in his chair. Frank ran full speed to where Mr. Rupert was. He made a full stop when he got to the porch. Then he walked slowly and hugged Rupert. He went inside and greeted Elaine with a hug as well. She patted his head gently. She would always do this every time, which Frank had come to expect. He liked how gentle it felt every time she did this. Elaine asked him how old he was, and he told her he was 10. Frank's parents came into the house and greeted Elaine. That was his cue to go outside and join Rupert. One of the things that made him excited to visit was that Rupert would always have a story ready for him. He loved listening to Rupert's stories. He had read a few books back home, but there was just something special about sitting down and listening to a good story by Rupert. Frank went out the door and stood beside Rupert, who was admiring the view of their neighbourhood. Rupert asked him, "Are you ready, son?" He smiled from ear to ear and eagerly nodded. "Then pull up a chair," he said. Frank grabbed the little stool next to Rupert's rocking chair. Rupert tilted his chair so that he could look at Frank as he was telling the story. Frank sat in the stool as he eagerly awaited for Rupert to start. He could feel his excitement wanting to burst out. Rupert took a deep breath and then started. Once upon a time there lived a knight. He was one of the fiercest warriors in the kingdom of Magon. He had been part of countless battles with his fellow knights, and all of them emerged victorious. Their kingdom remained peaceful for many years, but one day that peace was threatened. The people of the kingdom became restless once they heard that one of the villagers had been attacked by a griffin. In order for his royal subjects to feel safe again, the king ordered his knights to find the griffin in every corner of the kingdom and slay it. And so the knights did as his king ordered and travelled to find the griffin. The knight knew that slaying the griffin would bring great honour for his family. He travelled far into the mountains. He had heard from a wise old man that griffins are hidden deep within the mountains, where no living soul would dare enter. He travelled day and night. He slept on the ground. Sometimes the cold wind would make him shiver. He would hear strange noises moving through the forest. His grip on his sword would then tighten. Along the way, he stopped by a small village. The people were kind enough to offer him food and shelter for the night before he continued on his travels. He asked one of the villagers if they had been terrorized by a griffin recently. The villager told him that they hadn't, and that their village was always peaceful. But They would hear strange noises coming from the mountain. They didn't know what it was, and no one was brave enough to travel up the mountain. They believed that there were monsters lurking there. After hearing what the villagers said, the knight was eager to go up the mountain. He ate to his heart's content that night and rested. The next morning he thanked the villagers and bid them farewell. He started his journey up the mountain, hoping to find the griffin. Their storytelling was briefly interrupted by Elaine, who brought juice and cookies for Frank and a cup of coffee for Rupert. Elaine left the tray on the table and went back inside. Frank took a bite of Elaine's delicious cookies and wished that he could eat them every day for the rest of his life. Rupert took a sip of his coffee, then continued with the story. The knight made his way up the mountain. He carefully walked through the trees. He listened to every noise he heard. He kept his hand on his sword, tightly gripping its handle, ready to unsheath it should the need arise. He stopped just short of the mountain top when he saw a cave. He approached the cave with caution. He heard noises inside. He unsheathed his sword and steadied his heart. He knew the griffin had to be inside. And it was. The griffin saw him and charged towards him. He swung his sword, but the griffin managed to avoid his blade. The griffin towered over him. It stood on its hind legs with its wings spread out. It tried to pierce his armor with its claws. Luckily, his armor was made by the best blacksmith in the kingdom. But the griffin was strong. He may have avoided its claws with the armor on his arm, but the strength of the blow almost broke him. He had to take a few paces backwards. He was breathing heavily now. He centered himself, ready to take another swing. The griffin came charging towards him again. He waited for the right moment to swing his sword. Once the griffin was just a few inches from him, he swung his sword with all his might. At the last second, the griffin managed to dodge, but the knight still managed to cut it on the arm. The cut on its arm was deep. The griffin fell back and hit the side of the cave. The knight saw this as an opening for him to slay the beast. He ran towards the griffin with his sword in his hand, ready to make the final blow. But then he heard a noise from deeper within the cave. It made him stop abruptly. He turned towards where the noise was and steadied himself again. There might be another griffin. He was shocked to learn that the noise came from younglings hiding behind a rock. The griffin's younglings looked terrified. One of the younglings ran to the griffin's side. The griffin shielded the youngling with its wing. He looked at the griffin. It looked tired and in pain. He realized that the griffin was merely protecting its young. There was no monster here, just a parent trying to protect its young. He sheathed his sword and left the cave. He came back to the cave the next day with 3 wild boars and some medicine he brought from the village below the mountain. The griffin had moved further inside the cave, still in pain from its wound. He took off his armor and dropped his sword. He wanted the griffin to know that he meant no harm. He fed the griffin and its young with the boars he bought. He used the medicine he bought to heal the griffin's wounds. He stayed in the cave for a few nights, and when the griffin finally recovered, he left. He returned to the king's castle empty-handed, but he didn't care. He decided that his days as a knight were over. He bid farewell to the king. The knight spent his days living peacefully with his wife. They lived in a house on top of a mountain. One day, while he was outside admiring the horizon, he saw a winged creature flying in the sky. It came closer and closer until it landed beside their house. It was the griffin and its young. Its young had gotten bigger since the last time he saw them. He didn't know how the griffin found him. Maybe it spent its days looking for him. He welcomed the griffin with open arms. He even introduced it to his wife. He picked up his sword and went into the forest. He came back with 4 wild boars this time. They dined with the griffin and its young that day. From that moment on, the griffin and its young would come to visit the knight and his wife every year. The knight would wait patiently until his friend came to visit him again. "The end," Rupert said. Frank, with a big smile on his face, clapped his hands when Rupert finished. It was one of Rupert's best stories yet. They eventually said their goodbyes, and Frank and his family returned home. On their way home, Frank asked his father why his grandfather wanted them to keep visiting Rupert and Elaine once a year. He enjoyed visiting them so much that he never bothered to ask his father why. His father smiled at him and said, "Rupert was an old friend of your grandfather. Your grandfather promised him that he would always come and visit, even if it was just once a year. And I'd like to keep that promise. I'm hoping one day you'll keep that promise too." "Of course I will. I'll never get tired of visiting Rupert and Elaine," Frank said. He asked his father how his grandfather became friends with Rupert, but his father said it was a story for another time. Frank thought that he would ask Rupert the next time they came to visit. He also promised himself that when they came back to visit Rupert and Elaine, he would be their storyteller. The end. Ghost Mouse by Michael Morrell. Grandma's reaction is sharply focused and etched permanently in my memory. Only a beat after he had scampered past, she swiveled around, her whiskered face contorted as if she had taken the deepest suck on the tartest of lemons, and with the venom of 1,000 vipers squeaked 2 words, "He's unlucky." All I understood was that there must have been something deeply wrong with that mouse to provoke such a reaction from someone I loved so dearly. I hadn't given much thought to ghost mice since then. I don't know how, but it just became something I, and all the other mice I knew, accepted. You were not to associate with them if you could help it. If you did, you deserved what was coming to you. On my first day of training, my older sister Miranda was coerced into accompanying me. We left our home in the ceiling cavity, squeezing through the gap in the plaster. Miranda paused to sniff for danger and then took off along the rafter. I followed as closely as possible. Down below, a streak of white caught my eye. Running along where the wall met the shop floor was the second ghost mouse I ever saw. It was dark, but his white fur stood out regardless. "What are you doing?" Miranda called. I snapped back to the present and ran to catch up. "You're so weird," she admonished. She looked down, and when she saw the ghost mouse, made a hissing sound through her teeth. "Why are they unlucky?" I asked her. "Dunno," she grunted, as if it was the stupidest question ever. "It's always been like that. Everyone knows you get near a ghost mouse and you get what's coming to you. Come on, we'll be late." By night the marketplace belonged to mice, but it was still a perilous place. Danger is ever present in our world. During day, humans set up giant piles of delectable produce. You'd think they'd share a morsel, they certainly have enough left over, but they pack it all up, then hose the whole place down. On a mouse's 21st day, we joined the night squad to train for ration raids. We learned to scour the market for treasure troves of food while avoiding getting into a pickle. Training was held within the drain by the market's entrance. The ghost mouse was there when we arrived. As soon as we dropped him through the grate, my eyes zeroed in on him. He was hard to miss. A ring of space separated him from the rest of the group like a moat around a castle. Miranda nudged me away from him as we moved past. Major Max called the squad to attention. Pride and apprehension tumbled around inside of me as he welcomed us. He lectured us in an authoritative drone, and I scanned the other newbies for their reactions. Pairs of eager black eyes were trained upon him, along with one red pair. "For the well-trained nose," the Major intoned, "the marketplace is a bounty of tasty tidbits. But danger lurks in some places more so than others. Tonight you will explore the safer green zones. When you've proven yourself up to snuff with green, you'll move on to orange. And finally, only once there's no doubt of your capability in situations of high pressure and risk, red." We were split into groups of 3 and assigned an older guide, then sent off to commence green zone exploration. "These drains are the perfect place to start," Molly, our guide, explained. "They score highly for both safety and abundance. Most scraps are washed down here, and not much else can enter besides us. You just need to be wary of flash flooding when it rains. Over this way." Molly led on, continuing her spiel as we walked. Mia, whose family nest was close by ours, rolled her eyes at me. "Won't find me down here," she whispered. "Why not?" I replied. "Mama collects most of our food here." "Soggy filth," she returned, screwing her nose up in disgust. The ghost mouse, the third in our group, spoke up. "It's fine. We eat from here too." Mia's face oozed disdain. "I'd expect that," she scoffed. Mia's cynical commentary continued throughout the training. At any opportunity, Molly's instruction was unsubtly punctuated with sniggers, sighs and headshakes. All this was pitched in my direction as if I was a co-conspirator. It took all the energy I could muster to clamp my mouth shut. By break time, we were back above ground in the loading bay. I moved away from the others to get some much-needed alone time. "You okay?" It was the ghost mouse. "Fine," I answered curtly, turning away. He persisted. "She's pretty intense. You must be exhausted." I didn't reply. He took a step closer. Instinctively, I stepped away. "Want some?" he offered. I glanced at his outstretched paw, a chunk of cauliflower. I wanted to take it, but was prevented by an image of Grandma's face in my mind. "I know what you're thinking," he said, "about luck. You don't believe it, do you?" "Of course not," I huffed, and took the morsel from him. We sat quietly for a bit, nibbling. "I'm Miles," he said. "Marco," I replied, tucking my unswallowed mouthful in my cheek. "Thanks." "What are you doing?" It was Mia. "You're not sharing food with him, are you?" she said accusingly. Miles looked at me, waiting for my reaction, but I remained silent. She spat on the ground and dragged a paw across it, marking a curse barrier between herself and us. I opened my mouth in defence, but movement at the head of the loading bay stopped me short. It was a dog, silhouetted by the streetlight, its shadow stretched across the ground. It padded our way, snout down. Grandma's face reappeared in my mind. Sensing the heat of her burning gaze, I dropped the cauliflower. I could see Molly back where we had left her, crouching in the gutter behind a chip packet, frozen, just like us. Her leg muscles twitched, ready to dash. I knew the risk assessment she'd be going through. If she stayed still long enough, the dog could turn and leave. But if it came close enough, it could pick up her scent. How close could she allow it to get, while still being sure she could outrun it? The dog stopped in its tracks. "Go, Molly," Mia whispered beneath her breath. The dog snorted. It crouched down stealthily, its entire body focused. Hunting mode. "Please go," Mia pleaded from afar. "Please, please." It crept, painstakingly slow. With only a pounce's length left, Mia could contain herself no longer. "Go!" she screeched. Molly ran, as did her hunter. In terror we watched her zip by us, her foe hot on her heels. She darted behind a pile of boxes. The dog barked and pawed at them, nudged them with its nose. "Let's go!" Mia squealed in panic and took off down an adjacent alley. The dog's attention shifted. It left the cardboard jumble and its paws skidding on the cobblestones, took off after us. My feet barely touched the ground as I hurtled down the alley. I don't know what was faster, my scurrying feet or my pounding heart. I heard Miles call from behind, "It's a dead end!" He was right. The back doors of the meat hall were ahead but firmly closed. "What do we do? What do we do?" Mia panted, pulling up to a halt, her eyes wide as she watched the dog bearing down on us. By the doors was a gigantic metal dumpster. Miles scurried into the gap underneath. I followed shortly behind. Mia was left no choice but to do so too. From our fortress, we watched the dog's paws traipse back and forth around the perimeter of the bin. Its muzzle appeared and it barked its frustration. I could see saliva oozing between its fangs. Trying another tack, it stuck its paw into the gap. We pressed ourselves against the wall to avoid its swiping claws. "What now?" I asked, not really expecting an answer. "There," Miles said, pointing. Above us, in the corner of the dumpster's rust-corroded underbelly, was a hole. "We're not going in there," stated Mia, shaking her head adamantly. "That's red zone. We go in there, there's only 2 ways out. Back out the same hole and be swallowed by the dog, or wait till morning and be swallowed by the garbage monster." "What do we do then?" I asked. "We've got to run for it." I peered beyond the barking dog's jaws along the long stretch of alleyway, then at Miles. I closed my eyes. Those 2 words of Grandma's echoed through my brain. I shook my head and reopened my eyes. Miles's red eyes glowed. "Trust me," he said. I nodded. He made a run for it and leapt into the hole. I didn't wait for Mia's permission. I followed immediately after. The dog barked and swatted with its paw, but I was clear. We peered down at Mia and tried shouting over the dog's din for her to join us. She kept glancing between us and the alley, but finally went for it. The dog swiped. Its claw clipped her hind legs, sending her tumbling. She righted herself, scuttled desperately, then leapt. We grabbed her by the fur and pulled her into the dumpster. Mia wailed at me as soon as she was on her feet. "This is it. Never trust a ghost mouse. There's no way out of here. We're done for." "Quit it, Mia," I ordered. "Give him a chance." Miles took no notice. His nose twitched, taking in our surroundings. I took a sniff too. One smell dominated all others. Food. We were at the bottom of a massive mountain of refuse, the biggest cache of grub I'd ever come in contact with. but we had no time to stop and wonder. We made our way upwards through the maze of rotting food scraps and packaging, squelching, sliding, clambering and squeezing. It became lighter as we climbed, and the air fresher. At the summit it became apparent why. The dumpster was overfilled. Its lid was not completely closed. We perched on the rim and peered down at the dog far below. It was still on its belly, barking madly at the hole where we'd disappeared. Across from us was a drain pipe. The void between us was vast, but there was no other escape option. Banishing all thoughts of becoming a dog's dinner, I launched myself through the air in a wide arc and grabbed onto the pipe's bracket at the end of my flight. I looked back. Miles was trying to persuade Mia to follow, but she was adamantly refusing. Her arms were crossed tightly, a stubborn frown fixed to her face. I wanted to scream, "Leave her!" but dared not. So far we had gone unnoticed. How long would that last? I saw Miles speak in Mia's ear. Her consternation amplified as she listened. She puffed up, then deflated again with a disgruntled sigh. She turned huffily away from him, teetered on the edge, then leapt. She caught hold of the bracket with her front paws and kicked at the drain pipe, scrabbling to get a foothold. I reached down and she snatched my paw. She clambered over the top of me, kneed me in the guts, stamped on my head. Without a squeak or backward glance, she scrambled up the drain pipe and disappeared over the edge of the gutter. Miles bounded across, and soon we were also up the pipe and safe on the roof. Mia was nowhere to be seen, probably trying to put as much distance in between her and the ghost mouse as she could, and no doubt she'd be keen to get back and tell her version of what had happened. We sat in between the two tiles, taking a moment to calm ourselves and allow the adrenaline to subside. We were wedged closely together, and I could feel Miles's white fur brushing up against my own with every intake of air. This time I didn't move away. "Miles," I whispered, head down. "I'm sorry if being unfriendly before." "Let's leave it," he said. "You figured it out. That's the main thing." We sat for a bit, long enough for me to feel I needed to say something before it became awkward. "What did you say to Mia?" I asked. "To make her jump?" Miles grinned. "I told her that she could stay. I told her she could even climb back down and chance it along the alley if she wanted. But if she did, I would stick right by her like glue." I giggled. Down below in the laneway, the dog's barking quietened and finally ceased. "And the dumpster lid?" I asked. "How did you know it would be open?" He shrugged and winked one of his shiny red eyes. "Just lucky, I guess." The end. Katie and Her Best Friend by Glenn Francis F. Failnar. Katie had always felt like she never connected with anyone. There was no one she considered a friend. So when her parents decided to move, she was okay with it. She didn't feel sad because she wasn't leaving anyone behind. She was 8 when they moved to a new town. It wasn't that different from where they'd lived before. There were a lot of trees and kids running around outside, riding bikes and playing. One day her mother caught her staring out the window at some kids playing. Her mum told her to go out and play with those kids. So Katie went out. She could see they were all having fun and she wanted to join in, but she was afraid. She tried to muster up the courage to ask them if she could play, but she just couldn't do it. She decided to go for a walk instead. She liked how peaceful the town was. The people seemed nice and polite. Her stroll eventually led her to the town's lake. She felt the rush of cold air hitting her face. The beauty of the lake was something to behold. She sat there admiring it and decided that this would be her spot, that she would come here every day and maybe one day she would bring her friends here. After school, she would always stop by the lake before going home. She swore she could stay there for hours, maybe even live there. If she ever got hungry, she'd always have her food ready in her bag. She was writing a poem about the lake when she suddenly heard her stomach growl. She put down her notebook and her pen and got her sandwich out. She was just about to take a bite when she heard a noise. This startled her. She hadn't heard anything strange in all the days she'd been there. She looked around, but no one else was there. Then she noticed that there was something moving in the water. Curious to find out what it was, she walked closer to the water. She clenched her sandwich tight as she got closer and closer. When she was by the water, it stopped. Then all of a sudden something came out of the water and Katie got splashed with the water. She wiped the water from her eyes and saw something she had never seen before. She saw a dragon. She couldn't believe what she saw. She fell back on the ground and dropped her sandwich. She was terrified. The dragon was huge. She couldn't speak or shout. She was too afraid of what she saw. The dragon submerged its neck back into the water until only its eyes could be seen. Katie looked into the dragon's eyes and saw something very familiar. Like her, it had lonely eyes. Katie stood up and started walking towards it. She picked up her sandwich and then offered it to the dragon. The dragon didn't move, so she dropped the sandwich in the water and the dragon went after it. Moments later, the dragon stuck its neck out from underwater again. She got splashed with water, but she didn't mind it this time. It even made her laugh. The dragon moved its head closer to her. She reached out her hand and touched its nose. Its scales were rough but not unpleasant. She introduced herself to it. The dragon nodded as if to say, "Nice to meet you, Katie." From then on, Katie and the dragon became friends. Every day, Katie would bring 5 extra sandwiches for her friend. She would tell the dragon everything that happened to her at school. Sometimes she would sing or dance and the dragon would just nod along. For the first time, she didn't feel lonely. She even thought of the dragon as her best friend. In school, her teacher had asked the class to write a poem about their best friend, which they would read in front of the whole class. She wrote her poem while she was hanging out at the lake. After writing it, she read it to the dragon. The dragon tapped his nose on Katie's chest. It meant that the dragon liked it. At least, that's how she understood it. Katie read it in class the next day. She was the only one who had a dragon in her poem. Her classmates laughed and thought it was sad that her only friend was an imaginary dragon. She got angry and told them that the dragon wasn't imaginary. She told them that it was real and that she would prove it to them. After class, all her classmates went with her to the lake. She proved to them that she wasn't lying and there was a dragon in the lake. Everyone was in awe of the dragon. Some of them got scared, but she was able to convince them that it was harmless. Every day, her classmates would go with her to the lake after school. They would spend time with her and the dragon. All of them would play games, sing and dance. She didn't want it to end. Having many friends gave her joy. It didn't make her feel lonely anymore. Then one morning on a weekend, she went to the lake to visit her best friend. When she got there, she noticed that the dragon was laying its head on the ground. She knelt next to it and tried to soothe her friend. When she saw its eyes, she could tell that it was sad. The dragon moved its nose and rubbed it against her chin. Katie felt like the dragon was saying goodbye. Tears began to fall from her eyes as she wrapped her arms around its nose. She didn't want her best friend to go. The dragon then pulled away and submerged back into the water. Katie stood up. On the horizon, she saw the dragon burst out of the water and disappear into the clouds. She spent all night crying. She was never going to see her best friend again. Most of her classmates didn't come back to the lake after that. There was no dragon to see, so there was no point in going back there anymore. Some of them still wanted to play and hang out at the lake, but with each passing day, fewer people came until none of them came back. Katie was back where she started. She was all alone again on the lake. It didn't bother her though. She'd sit there day in and day out, hoping and waiting for her best friend to come back. And if the dragon did return, she promised herself that she'd keep it a secret from everyone. She still brings 5 extra sandwiches, just in case. One day, Katie was sitting by the lake looking at the horizon. She felt the cold wind as it enveloped her body. She hugged her knees, buried her face between them. After convincing herself that every day she wasn't that lonely, she finally admitted that she was. She cried. It was too painful. Suddenly she heard a noise. She looked up, but there was no one in front of her. She was hoping that it was the dragon. Then she noticed that someone was sitting beside her. It was one of her classmates. His name was Dylan. "What are you doing here?" she asked. He didn't answer her. "Are you waiting for the dragon?" He remained silent and kept staring at the horizon. This made her mad. She stood up and said, "The dragon's not coming back, okay? My best friend isn't coming back." Tears started falling from her eyes again. She wiped her eyes and said, "So, you can just leave, okay? You can stop coming round to the lake like everybody else." He smiled and said, "I didn't come here for the dragon." "Then why did you come here?" she said. He looked at her and said, "I wanted to ask you if you wanted to be friends with me." "You want to be my friend?" "Yes, I was too afraid to ask before. When I finally had the courage to ask, I was too late. Everybody in the class started coming to the lake. Seeing as you had so many, I figured you didn't need any more friends." Katie sat down beside him and said, Everyone just wanted to be friends with me because they thought I was cool for having a dragon as a friend. Well, they're all stupid then, he said, because you're pretty cool even without the dragon. Katie smiled and offered him a sandwich. From that point on, they became friends. The end. Sunshine by Katie Simmons. Sunshine is a girl, always barefoot, with long brown hair stretching down her back, highlighted with the colours of autumn, rich golds and fiery reds. Her slanted eyes are strikingly deep purple against her skin. She glows with happiness and adventure. This is what makes her beautiful, shining from the inside out. It's late afternoon in the Australian bush. Sunshine swings her basket as she skips past the familiar gum trees, which are covered in long green strands of leaves, softly flowing in the wind like hair. Gentle dusk light is filtering through the trees and lighting up the grass like a fluorescent carpet. Sunshine promised her best friends they would have a feast of all their favourite foods at sunset. Sunshine bounces and skips through the bush and greets nature as it's beginning to wind down. Good afternoon to the magpies who are starting to sing. G'day to the grumbling wombat beginning to wake up. And hello to Mr. Moon beginning to peek through the crisp blue sky. Sunshine arrives at her favourite clearing just as the sun is beginning to set and unpacks her food onto a big cracked tree stump. A blueberry pie, carrot and pine nut noodles, sweet rhubarb brownies, pumpkin rice with fluffy cream and strawberry, orange and mint juice. Sunshine sits down cross-legged and patiently waits, feeling the sunset gently warming her skin. One by one her friends arrive, Ruby the rabbit, Honey the platypus, Atlas the possum, Bouncy the baby kangaroo, and Electric the echidna. Sunshine greets her friends with a friendly good morning. Being nocturnal animals, Sunshine's friends have just awoken after happily sleeping all day. They all gather around the tree stump and fill their tummies with the goodness of food, the rainbow of tastes pulling them into a blissful half-sleep. They fall back onto the soft long grass and watch the fluffy clouds float past above them. Sunshine sees a dragon breathing fire and a handsome man with a kind smile. Ruby sees a bunch of big crunchy carrots. Honey sees lots of silvery fish swimming. Atlas sees a baby possum just like her. Bouncy sees a giant kangaroo fighting evil. And Electric sees an echidna, but instead of spikes, she is covered in fluffy cloud. The sky starts to turn pink, making the clouds look like cotton candy, then turning a soft violet. Her friends start to hop, scuttle and waddle home with full bellies and smiles on their little faces. Sunshine feels an immense happiness wash over her, sending her into a deep slumber. Sunshine opens her eyes and sees that the sun has gone and Mr. Moon is up, shining brightly like a giant glowing cream pie. Her surroundings have changed. Everything is tinted a periwinkle blue, and there are dark shadows swaying around her. The soft light from the moon and stars gently bathe her skin in light. She hears crickets chirping and the flutter of birds who are finding their way to bed. The smell of jasmine and honeysuckle hangs softly in the air, pulling Sunshine out of her sleep. She slowly rises, stretching like a long, lanky cat, and packs up her basket. There are glowing white flowers covering the clearing. They look like small ladies dancing in the breeze. Gracefully fluttering in the air are butterflies as big as her hands, with wings patterned with gold, orange and fuchsia, glowing brightly. Sunshine is grateful for this extra light, which will help her find her way home. She exits the clearing and starts to walk through the dreamlike bush. It is very quiet. She can hear the wind rustling through the leaves and the soft sounds of the nighttime animals. Amongst the branches are lots of beady gold eyes watching her. Sunshine knows they belong to the very kind owls and cheeky fruit bats. After some time walking, Sunshine suddenly realizes she isn't sure which way her home is. She starts to head back the way she came so she can go back to the clearing and retrace her steps, but she seems to be getting deeper and deeper into unknown trees. Sunshine closes her eyes, takes a deep breath and continues walking. working out a plan with each step. She has lots of friends in the forest. She will ask them for help. She stops and looks at the shining moon through the trees. "Gentle Mr. Moon, will you help me find my way home?" Sunshine whispers. "To be like the moon, always see the big picture," the moon replies in a deep chuckling voice. Sunshine stares up in silence and waits for some more information. "Thank you, Mr. Moon," she finally says, continuing on her way. Through the trees, Sunshine spots a patch of dark sky filled with stars blinking down at her. The big picture, Sunshine thinks. "How about you, little baby stars? Can you help me?" she says. "Even though we may be small, we have so much light to give. With lots of us and determination, we can light up the world. Even within darkness, keep shining your light," all the stars chime. "Thank you, baby stars," Sunshine says. Sunshine continues on through the trees with assurance and brightness. "Keep shining through the darkness," Sunshine thinks. As she thinks this thought, the scenery begins to change, the trees becoming more sparse. Sunshine can hear the soft trickling of water in the distance. She follows the light of the moon to an opening where she finds a large river. It is sparkling dark blue, like it's filled with sharply cut sapphires, with the moon and stars dancing in the reflection. The banks of the river are covered with soft green grass and mossy rocks. It's cooler here. The fresh breeze brushes through Sunshine's long hair and cools down her hot cheeks. Sunshine looks out across the river. "Hello, Miss River. It's nice to meet you," Sunshine says. "Good evening," says the river in a soothing, relaxed voice. "I'm not sure which way my home is. Could you help me?" With persistence, water can break through anything, even stone. "Oh, that is all I have for you," says the river. "Okay, well, thank you very much, Miss River." Sunshine sits on the banks of the river for a little while longer, swirling her feet around in the cold water to help relieve the soreness from her journey. She gets up and continues walking along the riverbank. "If I keep trying, I can do anything," Sunshine says to herself. She has now entered back into the bush, further upstream. She stops to listen. She can hear the familiar humming whisper of Grandmother Tree in the distance. Sunshine follows the whisper song through the trees until she reaches the giant grey gum tree. There are clusters of branches with the long greyish-green strands of leaves hanging down around the tree like a curtain. Sunshine gently moves through the leaves to find Granny's silver tree trunk, which is covered in a maze of deep lines and thick green moss. Sunshine has been coming here since she was very little, finding comfort in the worn, wrinkly bark and the fresh eucalyptus smell of her leaves. Sometimes she would fall asleep, cradled in her thick branches, after playing with the rainbow beetles, laughing along with the kookaburras, and talking to the possums that live among her. Grandmother Tree is so big, Sunshine knows she couldn't fit her arms across her in a hug, but she tries anyway, lying flat against her and embracing the tree like a long-lost family member. If Sunshine had a real family, Granny would be it. "Oh, hello, little one. How lovely to see you," Grandmother Tree says in a warm, crackly voice. "I'm afraid I'm lost, Granny. Will you help me?" says Sunshine, her face pressed against the cool bark. "My child, learn to be strong and hold yourself tall like me. Always be connected to the ground, but freely moving in the breeze." Sunshine takes this wisdom into her heart, like a missing piece of a jigsaw puzzle. She thanks Grandmother Tree and continues on. The dark is closing around the forest like a blanket. Sunshine is determined to get back. She takes a big breath, straightens her spine and holds her head up. If she has found Grandmother Tree, then she mustn't be too far from home. Sunshine is learning to trust her instincts, so she exits the clearing the way her body pulls her, towards a familiar tree and into the dark forest once again. "I am tall, just like a tree," Sunshine thinks, stretching up on her tippy toes as she walks. She's starting to feel a lot more confident in the way she's travelling, imagining that her warm, tiny cottage is not too far from here. She built it herself, with some help from her forest friends, out of wood, mud and leaves. They painted the front door a bright turquoise colour and the window frames a lemon yellow. Out the back is a small veggie patch filled with giant tomatoes, zucchinis, eggplant and pumpkins. In this meadow where her home is, lives Sunshine's cow, Barnabella, and her little calf, Patch. Barnabella is big, soft and brown, with sparkling blue eyes. Patch is small, with long legs and matching to his mother. Barnabella helps to keep the grass short in the meadow and keeps Sunshine company. Every morning, Sunshine collects Barnabella's extra milk, which she then drinks down while it's still warm, and then churns into butter and makes big wheels of cheese. Sunshine's mouth is watering at the thought of all that food. She didn't realize how long it had been since she ate. As she's walking, Sunshine spots a sleepy koala perched in the nook of a gum tree, slowly munching on some leaves. She walks to the tree, climbs up with her picnic basket and sits down on a branch next to the koala, her legs hanging down. Sunshine opens the basket on her lap and snacks on the leftover food from the picnic. "I think I'm nearly home, Mr. Koala," she says. The koala slowly blinks up at Sunshine. "Remember that it's always okay to take things slow, just like me," he says in a slow, sleepy voice. "Thank you very much," says Sunshine. Sunshine finishes her snacks and carefully climbs back down the gum tree and continues walking through the dark bush. Finally, Sunshine starts to recognize where she is and knows her beautiful home is not far away at all. She starts to walk faster in order to quickly break through to the familiar meadow. She runs through the trees and sees the shining sun peeking over the hill above her cottage. Sunshine sees Barnabella and Patch asleep further down in the meadow and her beautiful home perched on the hill above them. Sunshine says hello to the sun, which is lifting its frosty blanket to reveal a crisp light blue sky. Hello to her cottage, her flowers, her meadow and the beautiful trees. As Sunshine slowly walks through the long grass, she silently thanks all her friends for helping her find her way home. Sunshine enters her cottage, lights a fire, toasts some marshmallows, curls up on her cloud of a pillow, and falls asleep with leaves in her hair and sunshine in her heart. The end. The Stone of 5 Colors and the Empress Jokwa. A Japanese fairy tale compiled by Yi Theodora Ozaki. Long, long ago, there lived a great Chinese empress who succeeded her brother, the Emperor Fuki. It was the age of giants, and the Empress Jokwa, for that was her name, was 25 feet high, nearly as tall as her brother. She was a wonderful woman and an able ruler. There is an interesting story of how she mended a part of the broken heavens and one of the terrestrial pillars which upheld the sky, both of which were damaged during a rebellion raised by one of King Fuki's subjects. The rebel's name was Kokai. He was 26 feet high. His body was entirely covered with hair, and his face was as black as iron. He was a wizard and a very terrible character indeed. When the Emperor Fuki died, Kokai was bitten with the ambition to be Emperor of China, but his plan failed, and Jokwa, the dead emperor's sister, mounted the throne. Kokai was so angry at being thwarted in his desire that he raised a revolt. His first act was to employ the water devil, who caused a great flood to rush out over the country. This swamped the poor people out of their homes, and when the Empress Jokwa saw the plight of her subjects and knew it was Kokai's fault, she declared war against him. Now Jokwa the Empress had 2 young warriors called Hako and Aiko, and the former she made general of the front forces. Hako was delighted that the Empress's choice should fall on him, and he prepared himself for battle. He took up the longest lance he could find and mounted a red horse, and was just about to set out when he heard someone galloping hard behind him and shouting, "Hako, stop! The general of the front forces must be I!" He looked back and saw Aiko, his comrade, riding on a white horse in the act of unsheathing a large sword to draw upon him. Hako's anger was kindled, and as he turned to face his rival, he cried, "Insolent wretch! I have been appointed by the Empress to lead the front forces to battle. Do you dare to stop me?" "Yes," answered Aiko, "I ought to lead the army. It is you who should follow me." At this bold reply, Hako's anger burst from a spark into a flame. "Dare you answer me thus? Take that!" and he lunged at him with his lance. But Aiko moved quickly aside, and at the same time raising his sword, he wounded the head of the general's horse. Obliged to dismount, Hako was about to rush at his antagonist when Aiko, as quick as lightning, tore from his breast the badge of commandership and galloped away. This action was so quick that Hako stood dazed, not knowing what to do. The Empress had been a spectator of the scene, and she could not help but admire the quickness of the ambitious Iko, and in order to pacify the rivals, she determined to appoint them both to the generalship of the front army. So Hako was made commander of the left wing of the front army, and Iko of the right. 100,000 soldiers followed them and marched to put down the rebel Kokai. Within a short time, the two generals reached the castle where Kokai had fortified himself. When aware of their approach, the wizard said, "I will blow these two poor children away with one breath." He little thought how hard he would find the fight. With these words, Kokai seized an iron rod and mounted a black horse and rushed forth like an angry tiger to meet his two foes. As the two young warriors saw him tearing down upon them, they said to each other, "We must not let him escape alive," and they attacked him from the right and from the left with sword and with lance. But the all-powerful Kokai was not to be easily beaten. He whirled his iron rod around like the great water wheel, and for a long time they fought thus, neither side gaining nor losing. At last, to avoid the wizard's iron rod, Hako turned his horse too quickly. The animal's hoofs struck against a large stone, and in a fright the horse reared as straight on end as screen, throwing his master to the ground. Thereupon Kokai drew his three-edged sword and was just about to kill the prostrate Hako, but before the wizard could work his wicked will, the brave Iko had wheeled his horse in front of Kokai and dared him to try his strength with them, and not to kill a fallen man. But Kokai was tired, and he did not feel inclined to face this fresh and dauntless young soldier, so suddenly wheeling his horse around, he fled from the fray. Hako, who had only been slightly stunned, had by this time got upon his feet, and he and his comrade rushed after the retreating army, the one on foot and the other on horseback. Kokai, seeing that he was pursued, turned upon his nearest assailant, who was, of course, the mounted Iko, and drawing forth an arrow from the quiver at his back, fitted it to his bow and drew upon Iko. As quick as lightning, the wary Iko avoided the shaft, which only touched his helmet strings, and glancing off, fell harmless against Hako's coat of armour. The wizard saw that both his enemies remained unscathed. He also knew that there was no time to pull a second arrow before they would be upon him, so to save himself he resorted to magic. He stretched forth his wand, and immediately a great flood arose, and Jokwa's army and her brave young generals were swept away like a falling of autumn leaves on a stream. Hako and Iko found themselves struggling neck-deep in water, and looking around they saw the ferocious Kokai making towards them through the water with his iron rod on high. They thought every moment they would be cut down, but they bravely struck out to swim as far as they could from Kokai's reach. All of a sudden they found themselves in front of what seemed to be an island rising straight out of the water. They looked up, and there stood an old man with hair as white as snow, smiling at them. They cried to him to help them. The old man nodded his head and came down to the edge of the water. As soon as his feet touched the flood, it divided, and a good road appeared, to the amazement of the drowning men, who now found themselves safe. Kokai had by this time reached the island, which had risen as if by a miracle out of the water, and seeing his enemies thus saved, he was furious. He rushed through the water upon the old man, and it seemed as if he would surely be killed. But the old man appeared not in the least dismayed, and calmly awaited the wizard's onslaught. As Kokai drew near, the old man laughed aloud merrily, and turning into a large and beautiful white crane, flapped his wings and flew upwards into the heavens. When Hako and Iko saw this, they knew that their deliverer was no mere human being, was perhaps a god in disguise, and they hoped later on to find out who the venerable old man was. In the meantime, they had retreated, and it being now the close of day, for the sun was setting, both Kokai and the young warriors gave up the idea of fighting more on that day. That night, Hako and Iko decided it was useless to fight against the wizard Kokai, for he had supernatural powers, while they were only human. So they presented themselves before the Empress Jokwa. After a long consultation, the Empress decided to ask the Fire King, Shikuyu, to help her against the rebel wizard and to lead her army against him. Now Shikuyu, the Fire King, lived at the South Pole. It was the only safe place for him to be in, for he burnt up everything around him anywhere else, but it was impossible to burn up ice and snow. To look at, he was a giant and stood 30 feet high. His face was just like marble, and his hair and beard long and white as snow. His strength was stupendous, and he was a master of all fire, just as Kokai was of water. Surely, thought the Empress, Shikuyu can conquer Kokai. So she sent Aiko to the South Pole to beg Shikuyu to take up the war against Kokai in his own hands and conquer him once and for all. The Fire King, on hearing the Empress's request, smiled and said, "That is an easy matter, to be sure. It was none other than I who came to your rescue when you and your companion were drowning in the flood raised by Kokai." Aiko was surprised at learning this. He thanked the Fire King for coming to the rescue in their dire need, and then besought him to return with him and lead the war and defeat the wicked Kokai. Shikuyu did as he was asked, and returned with Aiko to the Empress. She welcomed the Fire King cordially, and at once told him why she had sent for him, to ask him to be the generalissimo of his army. His reply was very reassuring. "Do not have any anxiety. I will certainly kill Kokai." Shikuyu then placed himself at the head of 30,000 soldiers, and with Hako and Aiko showing him the way, marched to the enemy's castle. The Fire King knew the secret of Kokai's power, and he now told all the soldiers to gather a certain kind of shrub. This they burned in large quantities, and each soldier was then ordered to fill a bag full of the ashes thus obtained. Kokai, on the other hand, in his own conceit, thought that Shikuyu was of inferior power to himself, and he murmured angrily, "Even though you are the Fire King, I can soon extinguish you." Then he repeated an incantation, and the water floods rose and welled as high as the mountains. Shikuyu, not in the least frightened, ordered his soldiers to scatter the ashes which he had caused them to make. Every man did as he was bid, and such was the power of the plant that they had burned, that as soon as the ashes mingled with the water, a stiff mud was formed, and they were all safe from drowning. Now Kokai the wizard was dismayed when he saw that the Fire King was superior in wisdom to himself, and his anger was so great that he rushed headlong towards the enemy. Aiko rode to meet him, and the two fought together for some time. They were well matched in a hand-to-hand combat. Hako, who was carefully watching the fray, saw that Aiko began to tire, and fearing that his companion would be killed, he took his place. But Kokai had tired as well, and feeling himself unable to hold out against Hako, he said artfully, "You are too magnanimous, thus to fight for your friend and run the risk of being killed. I will not hurt such a good man." And he pretended to retreat, turning away the head of his horse. His intention was to throw Hako off his guard and then to wheel around and take him by surprise. But Shikuyu understood the wily wizard, and he spoke at once. "You are a coward. You cannot deceive me." Saying this, the Fire King made a sign to the unwary Hako to attack him. Kokai now turned upon Shikuyu furiously, but he was tired and unable to fight well, and he soon received a wound in the shoulder. He now broke from the fray and tried to escape in earnest. While the fight between their leaders had been going on, the two armies had stood waiting for the issue. Shikuyu now turned and bade Jokwa's soldiers charge the enemy forces. This they did and routed them with great slaughter, and the wizard barely escaped with his life. It was in vain that Kokai called upon the water devil to help him, for Shikuyu knew the counter-charm. The wizard found that the battle was against him. Mad with pain, for his wound began to trouble him, and frenzied with disappointment and fear, he dashed his head against the rocks of Mount Shu and died on the spot. There was the end of the wicked Kokai, but not of trouble in the Empress Jokwa's kingdom, as you shall see. The force with which the wizard fell against the rocks was so great that the mountain burst, and fire rushed out from the earth, and one of the pillars upholding the heavens was broken, so that one corner of the sky dropped until it touched the earth. Shikuyu, the Fire King, took up the body of the wizard and carried it to the Empress Jokwa, who rejoiced greatly that her enemy was vanquished and her generals victorious. She showered all manner of gifts and honours upon Shikuyu. But all this time, fire was bursting from the mountain broken by the fall of Kokai. Whole villages were destroyed, rice fields burnt up, riverbeds filled with the burning lava, and the homeless people were in great distress. So the Empress left the capital as soon as she had rewarded the victor Shikuyu, and journeyed with all the speed to the scene of the disaster. She found that both heaven and earth had sustained damage, and the place was so dark that she had to light her lamp to find out the extent of the havoc that had been wrought. Having ascertained this, she set to work at repairs. To this end she ordered her subjects to collect stones of 5 colours, blue, yellow, red, white, and black. When she had obtained these, she boiled them with a kind of porcelain in a large cauldron, and the mixture became a beautiful paste, and with this she knew that she could mend the sky. Now all was ready. Summoning the clouds that were sailing ever so high above her head, she mounted them and rode heavenwards, carrying in her hands the vase containing the paste made from the stones of 5 colours. She soon reached the corner of the sky that was broken, and applied the paste and mended it. Having done this, she turned her attention to the broken pillar, and with the legs of a very large tortoise, she mended it. When this was finished, she mounted the clouds and descended to the earth, hoping to find that all was now right. But to her dismay, she found that it was still quite dark. Neither the sun shone by day, nor the moon by night. Greatly perplexed, she at last called a meeting of all the wise men of the kingdom and asked their advice as to what she should do in this dilemma. 2 of the wisest said, "The roads of heaven have been damaged by the late accident, and the sun and moon have been obliged to stay at home. Neither the sun could make his daily journey, nor the moon her nightly one, because of the bad roads. The sun and moon do not yet know that your majesty has mended all that was damaged, and so we will go and inform them that since you have repaired them, the roads are safe." The empress approved of what the wise men suggested and ordered them to set out on their mission. But this was not easy, for the palace of the sun and moon was many, many hundreds of thousands of miles distant into the east. If they travelled on foot, they might never reach the place. They would die of old age on the road. But Jokwa had recourse to magic. She gave her 2 ambassadors wonderful chariots, which could whirl through the air by magic power 1,000 miles per minute. They set out in good spirits, riding above the clouds, and after many days they reached the country where the sun and moon were living happily together. The 2 ambassadors were granted an interview with their majesties of light, and they asked them why they had for so many days secluded themselves from the universe. Did they not know that by doing that they plunged the world and all its people into the uttermost darkness, both day and night? Replied the sun and moon, "Surely you know that Mount Shu has suddenly burst forth with fire, and the roads of heaven have been greatly damaged. I, the sun, found it impossible to make my daily journey along such rough roads, and certainly the moon could not issue forth at night, so we both retired into private life for a time." Then the 2 wise men bowed themselves to the ground and said, "Our Empress Jokwa has already repaired the roads with the wonderful stones of 5 colours, so we beg to assure your majesties that the roads are just as they were before the eruption took place." But the sun and the moon still hesitated, saying that they had heard that one of the pillars of heaven had been broken as well, and that they feared that, even if the roads had been remade, it would still be dangerous for them to sally forth on their usual journeys. "You need have no anxiety about the broken pillar," said the 2 ambassadors. "Our empress restored it with the legs of a great tortoise, and it is as firm as it ever was." Then the sun and moon appeared satisfied, and they both set out to try the roads. They found that what the empress's deputies had told them was correct. After the examination of the heavenly roads, the sun and moon again gave light to the earth. All the people rejoiced greatly, and peace and prosperity were secured in China for a long time under the reign of the wise Empress Jokwa. The end. The Daughter of the Mother in the Corner by Asbjørnsen and Moe. Once upon a time there was a woman who had a son, and he was so lazy and slow that there was not a single blessed useful thing he would do. But he liked to sing and to dance, and that is what he did all day long and far into the night as well. The longer this went on, the worse off his mother was. The youth was growing, and he wanted so much to eat that it was barely possible to find it, and more went for his clothes the older he grew, since his clothes did not last long, as you may imagine, because the youth skipped and danced about without stopping, through forest and field. At length it was too much for his mother, so one day she told the young fellow that he ought at last to get to work and really do something, or both of them would have to starve to death. But the youth had no mind to do so, he said, and would rather try to win the daughter of the mother in the corner, for if he got her, then he would live happily ever after, and could sing and dance and would not have to plague himself with work. When the mother heard that, she thought it might not be such a bad idea after all, and she dressed up the youth as well as she could, so that he would make a good showing when he came to the mother in the corner, and then he set forth. When he stepped out, the sun was shining bright and warm, but it had rained during the night, and the ground was soft and full of water puddles. The youth took the shortest path to the mother in the corner, and sang and danced as he always did. But suddenly, as he was hopping and skipping along, he came to a swamp, and there were only some logs laid down to cross it, and from the one log he had to jump over a puddle to a clump of grass, unless he wanted to dirty his shoes. And then he went kerflop. The very moment he set foot on the clump of grass, he went down and down till he was standing in a dark, ugly hole. At first he could see nothing at all, but when he had been there a little while, he saw that there was a rat who was wiggling and waggling around and had a bunch of keys hanging from her tail. "Have you come, my boy?" said the rat. "I must thank you for coming to visit me. I've been expecting you for a long time. I am sure you've come to win me, and I can well imagine that you are in a great hurry. But you must have a little patience. I am to receive a large dower, and I am not yet ready for the wedding, but I will do my best to see that we are married soon." When she had said this, she produced a couple of eggshells with all sorts of eatables such as rats eat, and set them down before the youth and said, "Now you must sit down and help yourself, for I am sure you are tired and hungry." The youth had no great appetite for this food. "If I were only away and up above again," thought he, but he said nothing. "Now I think you must surely want to get home again," said the rat. "I am well aware that you are waiting impatiently for the wedding, and I will hurry all I can. Take this linen thread along, and when you get up above you must not turn around but must go straight home, and as you go you must keep repeating, 'Short before and long behind.'" And with that she laid a linen thread in his hand. "Heaven be praised," said the youth when he was up above once more. "I'll not go down there again in a hurry." But he held the thread in his hand and danced and sang as usual. And although he no longer had the rat hole in mind, he began to hum, "Short before and long behind, short before and long behind." When he stood before the door at home, he turned around, and there lay many, many 100 yards of the finest linen, finer than the most skilful weaver could have spun. "Mother, come out," called and cried the youth. His mother came darting out and asked what was the matter. And when she saw the linen stretching as far as she could see, and then a bit, she could not believe her eyes, until the youth told her how it had all happened. But when she had heard that, and had tested the linen between her fingers, she was so pleased that she too began to sing and dance. Then she took the linen, cut it and sewed shirts from it for her son and herself, and the remainder she took to town and sold for a good price. Then for a time they lived in all joy and comfort. But when that was over, the woman had not a bite to eat in the house, and so she told her son that it was the highest time for him to take service and really do something, or else both of them would starve to death. But the youth preferred to go to the mother in the corner and try and win her daughter. His mother did not think this such a bad idea, for now the youth was handsomely dressed and made a good showing. So she brushed him and furbished him up as well as she could, and he himself took a new pair of shoes and polished them till they shone like a mirror, and when he had done so, off he went. Everything happened as before. When he stepped out, the sun was shining bright and warm, but it had rained during the night, and the road was soft and muddy, and every puddle was full of water. The youth took the shortest way to the mother in the corner, and sang and danced and danced and sang, as he always did. He followed another road, not the one he had taken before, but as he was hopping and skipping along, he suddenly came to the log across the swamp, and from the log he had to jump over a puddle to a clump of grass, unless he wanted to dirty his shoes. And then he went kerflop, and he sank down and could not stop until he reached a horrible, dark, ugly hole. At first he could see nothing, but after he had stood there a while, he discovered a rat with a bunch of keys at the end of her tail, which she was wiggling and waggling in front of him. "Have you come, my boy?" said the rat. "You are welcome amongst us. It was kind of you to come and visit me again so soon. No doubt you are very impatient. I can well imagine it. But you must really be patient a little while longer, for my trousseau is not quite complete. But by the time you come again, I shall be all ready." When she had said this, she offered him eggshells containing all sorts of food such as rats like, but it looked to the youth like food that had been eaten, and he said that he had no appetite. "If I were only safely away and up above again," thought he, but he said nothing. After a time the rat said, "Now I think that you must surely want to get up above again. I will hurry on the wedding as quickly as I can. And now take this woolen thread along, and when you get up above, you must not turn around but go straight home, and underway you must keep on repeating, 'short before and long behind.'" And with that she laid the woolen thread in his hand. "Thank heaven I have escaped," said the youth to himself. "I am sure I'll never go there again." And he sang and danced again as usual. He thought no more of the rat hole, but fell to humming, and sang without stopping, "Short before and long behind, short before and long behind." When he stood at the door of the house, he happened to look around, and there lay the finest woolen goods, many 100 yards of it, stretching for 1/2 mile, and so fine that no city councillor wore a coat of finer cloth. "Mother, mother, come out, cried the youth. His mother came to the door, clasped her hands together over her head, and nearly fainted with joy when she saw all the fine goods. And then the youth had to tell her how it had come to him, and all that had taken place from the beginning to the end. This brought them a small fortune, as you may imagine. The youth had new clothes, and his mother went to town and sold the goods yard by yard, and was handsomely paid for them. And then she decorated her room, and she herself, in her old days, went about in such style that she might have been taken for some lady of distinction. So they lived splendidly and happily, but finally this money too came to an end, and one day the woman had not a bite to eat left in the house, and told her son that now he had better look for work, and really do something, or both of them would starve to death. But the youth thought it would be much better to go to the mother in the corner and try to win her daughter. This time his mother again agreed with him and did not contradict the youth, for now he had fine new clothes and looked so distinguished that it seemed out of the question to her that such a good-looking fellow would be refused. So she furbished him up and tricked him out in the handsomest way, and he himself took out his new shoes and polished them so brightly that you could see yourself in them, and when he had done so, he set forth. This time he did not choose the shortest road, but took a roundabout way, the longest he could find, for he did not want to go down to the rat again, because he was sick of her eternal wiggling and waggling, and the talk about marriage. The weather and the road were exactly the same as when he had gone before. The sun shone, the swamp and the puddles gleamed, and the youth sang and danced as usual. And in the midst of his skipping and jumping, before he knew it, there he stood at the same crossing which led across the swamp. There he had to jump over a puddle to a clump of grass, unless he wanted to dirty his brightly polished shoes. Kerflop! And down he went, and did not stop until he stood once more in the same dark, ugly, dirty hole. At first he was pleased because he could see nothing, but after he had stood there a while, he once more discovered the ugly rat who was so repulsive to him, with a bunch of keys hanging from her tail. "Good day, my boy," said the rat. "You are welcome. I see that you can no longer live without me, and I thank you. And now everything is in readiness for our wedding, and we will go straight to the church." Nothing will come of that, thought the youth, but he did not say a word. Then the rat whistled, and at once every corner was alive with swarms of mice and small rats, and 6 large rats came dragging along a frying pan. 2 mice sat up behind as grooms, and 2 sprang up in front to drive the coach. Several seated themselves within, and the rat with the bunch of keys took her place in their midst. To the youth she said, "The road is a little narrow here, so you will have to walk beside the coach, sweetheart, until the road is broader, and then you may sit beside me in the coach." "How fine that will be," thought the youth. "If I were only safely up above once more, I would run away from the whole pack of them," thought he, but he said nothing. He went along with the procession as well as he could. At times he had to crawl, at others he had to stoop, for the way was very narrow. But when it grew better, he walked in advance and looked about to see how he might most easily steal away and make off. And then he suddenly heard a clear, beautiful voice behind him say, "Now the road is good. Come, sweetheart, and get into the coach." The youth turned around quickly and was so astonished that his nose and ears nearly fell off. There stood a magnificent coach with 6 white horses, and in the coach sat a maiden as fair and beautiful as the sun, and about her were sitting others as bright and kindly as the stars. It was a princess and her playmates who had all been enchanted together. But now they were delivered, because he had come down to them and had never contradicted. "Come along now," said the princess. Then the youth got into the coach and drove to the church with her. And when they drove away from the church, the princess said, "Now we will first drive to my home, and then we will send for your mother." "That's all very fine," thought the youth. He said nothing, but he thought it would be better, after all, to drive to his home instead of down the hideous rat hole. But suddenly they came to a beautiful castle, and there they turned in, for it was there that they were to live. And once a fine coach with 6 horses was sent for the youth's mother, and when she came, the wedding festivities began. They celebrated for 14 days, and perhaps they are celebrating yet. We must hurry, and perhaps we must still get there in time and can drink the groom's health and dance with the bride. The end.
Rose of Evening by Richard Wilhelm. This is a vintage fairy tale and may contain violence. We would encourage parents to read beforehand if your child is sensitive to such themes. On the 5th day of the 5th month, the festival of the dragon junk is held along the Yangtze Kiang. A dragon is hollowed out of wood, painted with an armor of scales, and adorned with gold and bright colors. A carved red railing surrounds this ship, and its sails and flags are made of silks and brocade. The after part of the vessel is called the dragon's tail. It rises 10 feet above the water, and a board which floats in the water is tied to it by means of a cloth. Upon this board sit boys who turn somersaults, stand on their heads, and perform all sorts of tricks. Yet, being so close to the water, their danger is very great. It is the custom, therefore, when a boy is hired for this purpose, to give his parents money before he is trained. Then, if he falls into the water and is drowned, no one has him on their conscience. Farther south, the custom differs insomuch that instead of boys, beautiful girls are chosen for this purpose. In Xiangyang, there once lived a widow named Di Xiang, who had a son called Aduan. When he was no more than 7 years of age, he was extraordinarily skillful, and no other boy could equal him. And his reputation increasing as he grew, he earned more and more money. So it happened that he was still called upon at the Dragon Junk Festival when he was already 16. But one day he fell into the water below the Gold Island and was drowned. He was the only son of his mother, and she sorrowed over him, and that was the end of it. Yet Aduan did not know that he had been drowned. He met 2 men who took him along with them, and he saw a new world in the midst of the waters of the Yellow River. When he looked around, the waves of the river towered steeply about him like walls, and a palace was visible, in which sat a man wearing armor and a helmet. His 2 companions said to him, "That is the prince of the dragon's cave," and bade him kneel. The prince of the dragon's cave seemed to be of a mild and kindly disposition, and said, "We can make use of such a skillful lad. He may take part in the dance of the willow branches." So he was brought to a spot surrounded by extensive buildings. He entered and was greeted by a crowd of boys who were all about 14 years of age. An old woman came in, and they all called out, "This is Mother Hia!" And she sat down and had Aduan show his tricks. Then she taught him the dance of the flying thunders of the Xiantang River, and the music that calms the winds on the sea of Dung Ting. When the cymbals and kettle drums re-echoed through all the courts, they deafened the ear. Then, again, all the courts would fall silent. Mother Hia thought that Aduan would not be able to grasp everything the very first time. So she taught him with great patience, but Aduan had understood everything from the first, and that pleased old Mother Hia. "This boy," said she, "equals our own Rose of Evening." The following day, the Prince of the Dragon's Cave held a review of his dancers. When all the dancers had assembled, the dance of the ogres was danced first. Those who performed it all wore devil masks and garments of scales. They beat upon enormous cymbals, and their kettle drums were so large that 4 men could just about span them. Their sound was like the sound of a mighty thunder, and the noise was so great that nothing else could be heard. When the dance began, tremendous waves spouted up to the very skies, and then fell down again like star glimmer, which scatters in the air. The Prince of the Dragon Cave hastily bade the dance cease, and had the dancers of the Nightingale round step forth. These were all lovely young girls of 16. They made a delicate music with flutes, so that the breeze blew and the roaring of the waves was stilled in a moment. The water gradually became as quiet as a crystal world, transparent to its lowest depths. When the Nightingale dancers had finished, they withdrew and posted themselves in the western courtyard. Then came the turn of the Swallow dancers. These were all little girls. One among them, who was about 15 years of age, danced the dance of the giving of flowers with flying sleeves and waving locks. And as their garments fluttered, many-colored flowers dropped from their folds, and were caught up by the wind and whirled about the whole courtyard. When the dance had ended, this dancer also went off with the rest of the girls to the western courtyard. Adawan looked at her from out of the corner of his eye, and fell deeply in love with her. He asked his comrades who she might be, and they told him she was named Rose of Evening. But the willow spray dancers were now called out. The Prince of the Dragon Cave was especially desirous of testing Adawan. So Adawan danced alone, and he danced with joy or defiance according to the music. When he looked up and when he looked down, his glances held the beat of the measure. The Dragon Prince, enchanted with his skill, presented him with a garment of 5 colors and gave him a carbuncle set in golden threads of fish beard for a hair jewel. Adawan bowed his thanks for the gift, and then also hastened to the western courtyard. There, all the dancers stood in rank and file. Adawan could only look at Rose of Evening from a distance, but still Rose of Evening returned his glances. After a time, Adawan gradually slipped to the end of his file, and Rose of Evening also drew near to him, so that they stood only a few feet away from each other. But the strict rules allowed no confusion in the ranks, so they could only gaze and let their souls go out to each other. Now, the butterfly dance followed the others. This was danced by the boys and girls together, and the pairs were equal in size, age, and the color of their garments. When all the dances had ended, the dancers marched out with the goose step. The willow spray dancers followed the swallow dancers, and Adawan hastened in advance of his company, while Rose of Evening lingered along after hers. She turned her head, and when she spied Adawan, she purposely let a coral pin fall from her hair. Adawan hastily hid it in his sleeve. When he had returned, he was sick with longing, and could neither eat nor sleep. Mother Hia brought him all sorts of dainties, looked after him 3 or 4 times a day, and stroked his forehead with loving care. But his illness did not yield in the least. Mother Hia was unhappy, and yet helpless. "The birthday of the king of the Wu River is at hand," said she. "What is to be done?" In the twilight, there came a boy who sat down on the edge of Adawan's bed and chatted with him. He belonged to the butterfly dancers, said he, and asked casually, "Are you sick because of Rose of Evening?" Adawan, frightened, asked him how he came to guess it. The other boy said, with a smile, "Well, because Rose of Evening is in the same case as yourself." Disconcerted, Adawan sat up and begged the boy to advise him. "Are you able to walk?" asked the latter. "If I exert myself," said Adawan, "I think I could manage it." So the boy led him to the south. There he opened a gate, and they turned the corner to the west. Once more the doors of the gate flew open, and now Adawan saw a lotus field about 20 acres in size. The lotus flowers were all growing on level earth, and their leaves were as large as mats, and their flowers like umbrellas. The fallen blossoms covered the ground beneath the stalks to the depth of a foot or more. The boy led Adawan in and said, "Now first of all sit down for a little while." Then he went away. After a time, a beautiful girl thrust aside the lotus flowers and came into the open. It was Rose of Evening. They looked at each other with happy timidity, and each told how each had longed for the other. And they also told each other of their former life. Then they weighted the lotus leaves with stones so that they made a cozy retreat in which they could be together, and promised to meet each other there every evening. And then they parted. Adawan came back, and his illness left him. From that time on, he met Rose of Evening every day in the lotus field. After a few days had passed, they had to accompany the Prince of the Dragon Cave to the birthday festival of the King of the Wu River. The festival came to an end, and all the dancers returned home. Only, the king had kept back Rose of Evening and one of the nightingale dancers to teach the girls in his castle. Months passed, and no news came from the Rose of Evening, so that Adawan went about full of longing and despair. Now Mother Hia went every day to the castle of the god of the Wu River, so Adawan told her that Rose of Evening was his cousin, and entreated her to take him along with her, so that he could at least see her a single time. So she took him along, and let him stay at the lodge house of the river god for a few days. But the indwellers of the castle were so strictly watched that he could not see Rose of Evening even a single time. Sadly, Adawan went back again. Another month passed, and Adawan, filled with gloomy thoughts, wished that death might be his portion. One day, Mother Hia came to him full of pity, and began to sympathize with him. "What a shame," said she, "that Rose of Evening has cast herself into the river." Adawan was extremely frightened, and his tears flowed resistlessly. He tore his beautiful garments, took his gold and his pearls, and went out with the sole idea of following his beloved in death. Yet the waters of the river stood up before him like walls, and no matter how often he ran against them, head down, they always flung him back. He did not dare return, since he feared he might be questioned about his festival garments, and severely punished because he had ruined them. So he stood there, and knew not what to do, while the perspiration ran down to his ankles. Suddenly, at the foot of the water wall, he saw a tall tree. Like a monkey, he climbed up to its very top, and then, with all his might, he shot into the waves. And then, without being wet, he found himself suddenly swimming on the surface of the water. Unexpectedly, the world of men rose up once more before his dazzled eyes. He swam to the shore, and as he walked along the riverbank, his thoughts went back to his old mother. He took a ship and traveled home. When he reached the village, it seemed to him as though all the houses in it belonged to another world. The following morning he entered his mother's house, and as he did so, heard a girl's voice beneath the window saying, "Your son has come back again." The voice sounded like the voice of Rose of Evening, and when she came to greet him at his mother's side, sure enough, it was Rose of Evening herself. And in that hour the joy of these two, who were so fond of each other, overcame all their sorrow. But in the mother's mind, sorrow and doubt, terror and joy mingled in constant succession in 1,000 different ways. When Rose of Evening had been in the palace of the River King and had come to realize that she would never see Adawan again, she determined to die, and flung herself into the waters of the stream. But she was carried to the surface, and the waves carried and cradled her till a ship came by and took her aboard. They asked whence she came. Now, Rose of Evening had originally been a celebrated singing girl of Wu, who had fallen into the river and whose body had never been found. So she thought to herself that, after all, she could not return to her old life again. So she answered, "Madame Xiang, in Xiangyang is my mother-in-law." Then the travelers took passage for her in a ship, which brought her to the place she had mentioned. The widow Tsiang first said she must be mistaken, but the girl insisted that there was no mistake, and told Aduan's mother her whole story. Yet, though the latter was charmed by her surpassing loveliness, she feared that Rose of Evening was too young to live a widow's life. But the girl was respectful and industrious, and when she saw that poverty ruled in her new home, she took her pearls and sold them for a high price. Aduan's old mother was greatly pleased to see how seriously the girl took her duties. Now that Aduan had returned again, Rose of Evening could not control her joy. And even Aduan's old mother cherished the hope that, after all, perhaps her son had not died. She secretly dug up her son's grave, yet all his bones were still lying in it. So she questioned Aduan. And then, for the first time, the latter realized that he was a departed spirit. Then he feared that Rose of Evening might disregard him with disgust because he was no longer a human being. So he ordered his mother, on no account, to speak of it, and this his mother promised. Then she spread the report in the village that the body which had been found in the river had not been that of her son at all, yet she could not rid herself of the fear that since Aduan was a departed spirit, heaven might refuse to send him a child. In spite of her fear, however, she was able to hold a grandson in her arms in the course of time. When she looked at him, he was no different from other children, and then her cup of joy was filled to overflowing. Rose of Evening gradually became aware of the fact that Aduan was not really a human being. "Why did you not tell me at once?" said she. "Departed spirits who wear the garments of the dragon castle surround themselves with a soul casing so heavy in texture that they can no longer be distinguished from the living. And if one can obtain the lime made of dragon horn, which is in the castle, then the bones may be glued together in such wise that flesh and blood will grow over them again. What a pity that we could not obtain the lime while we were there." Aduan sold his pearl, for which a merchant from foreign parts gave him an enormous sum. Thus, his family grew very wealthy. Once on his mother's birthday, he danced with his wife and sang in order to please her. The news reached the castle of the Dragon Prince, and he thought to carry off Rose of Evening by force. But Aduan, alarmed, went to the prince and declared that both he and his wife were departed spirits. They examined him, and since he cast no shadow, his word was taken, and he was not robbed of Rose of Evening. The end.
The White Hare and the Crocodiles by Yi Theodora Ozaki. Long, long ago, when all the animals could talk, there lived in the province of Inaba in Japan a little white hare. His home was on the island of Oki, and just across the sea was the mainland of Inaba. Now the hare wanted very much to cross over to Inaba. Day after day he would go out and sit on the shore and look longingly over the water in the direction of Inaba, and day after day he hoped to find some way of getting across. One day, as usual, the hare was standing on the beach, looking towards the mainland across the water, when he saw a great crocodile swimming near the island. "This is very lucky," thought the hare. "Now I shall be able to get my wish. I will ask the crocodile to carry me across the sea." But he was doubtful whether the crocodile would consent to do what he wanted. So he thought instead of asking a favour, he would try to get what he wanted by a trick. So with a loud voice he called to the crocodile and said, "Oh, Mr. Crocodile, isn't it a lovely day?" The crocodile, who had come out all by himself that day to enjoy the bright sunshine, was just beginning to feel a bit lonely when the hare's cheerful greeting broke the silence. The crocodile swam nearer the shore, very pleased to hear someone talk. "I wonder who it was that spoke to me just now. Was it you, Mr. Hare? You must be very lonely all by yourself." "Oh, no, I am not at all lonely," said the hare. "But as it was such a fine day, I came out here to enjoy myself. Won't you stop and play with me for a little while?" The crocodile came out of the sea and sat on the shore, and the two played together for some time. Then the hare said, "Mr. Crocodile, You live in the sea, and I live on this island, and we do not often meet, so I know very little about you. Tell me, do you think the number of your company is greater than mine?" "Of course there are more crocodiles than hares," answered the crocodile. "Can you not see that for yourself? You live on this small island, while I live in the sea, which spreads through all parts of the world. So if I call together all the crocodiles who dwell in the sea, you hares will be as nothing compared to us." The crocodile was very conceited. The hare, who meant to play a trick on the crocodile, said, "Do you think it possible for you to call up enough crocodiles to form a line from this island across the sea to Inaba?" The crocodile thought for a moment and then answered, "Of course, it is possible." "Then do try," said the artful hare, "and I will count the number from here." The crocodile, who was very simple-minded and who hadn't the least idea that the hare intended to play a trick on him, agreed to do what the hare asked and said, "Wait a little while I go back into the sea and call my company together." The crocodile plunged into the sea and was gone for some time. The hare, meanwhile, waited patiently on the shore. At last the crocodile appeared, bringing with him a large number of other crocodiles. "Look, Mr. Hare," said the crocodile, "it is nothing for my friends to form a line between here and Inaba. There are enough crocodiles to stretch from here even as far as China or India. Did you ever see so many crocodiles?" Then the whole company of crocodiles arranged themselves in the water so as to form a bridge between the island of Oki and the mainland of Inaba. When the hare saw the bridge of crocodiles, he said, "How splendid! I did not believe this was possible. Now let me count you all. To do this, however, with your permission, I must walk over on your backs to the other side, so please be good as not to move, or else I shall fall into the sea and be drowned." So the hare hopped off the island onto the strange bridge of crocodiles, counting as he jumped from one crocodile's back to the other. "Please keep quite still, or I shall not be able to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Thus the cunning hare walked right across to the mainland of Inaba. Not content with getting his wish, he began to jeer at the crocodiles instead of thanking them, and said as he leapt off the last one's back, "Oh, you stupid crocodiles, now I have done with you." And he was just about to run away as fast as he could. But he did not escape so easily, for as soon as the crocodiles understood that this was a trick played upon them by the hare so as to enable him to cross the sea, and that the hare was now laughing at them for their stupidity, they became furiously angry and made up their minds to take revenge. So some of them ran after the hare and caught him. Then they all surrounded the poor little animal and pulled out all his fur. He cried out loudly and entreated them to spare him, but with each tuft of fur they pulled out, they said, "Serves you right." When the crocodiles had pulled out the last bit of fur, they threw the poor hare on the beach and all swam away, laughing at what they had done. The hare was now in a pitiful plight. All his beautiful white fur had been pulled out, and his bare little body was quivering with pain and bleeding all over. He could hardly move, and all he could do was to lie on the beach quite helpless and weep over the misfortune that had befallen him. Notwithstanding that it was his own fault that had brought this misery and suffering upon the white hare of Inaba, anyone seeing the poor little creature could not help feeling sorry for him in his sad condition, for the crocodiles had been very cruel in their revenge. Just at this time a number of men, who looked like kings' sons, happened to pass by, and seeing the hare lying on the beach crying, stopped and asked what was the matter. The hare lifted up his head from between his paws and answered them, saying, "I had a fight with some crocodiles, but I was beaten, and they pulled out all my fur and left me to suffer here. That is why I'm crying." Now one of these young men had a bad and spiteful disposition, but he feigned kindness and said to the hare, "I feel very sorry for you. If you will only try it, I know of a remedy which will cure your sore body. Go and bathe yourself in the sea, and then come and sit in the wind. This will make your fur grow again, and you will be just as you were before." Then all the young men passed on. The hare was very pleased, thinking that he had found a cure. He went and bathed in the sea, and then came out and sat where the wind could blow upon him. But as the wind blew and dried him, his skin became drawn and hardened, and the salt increased the pain so much that he rolled on the sand in his agony and cried aloud. Just then another king's son passed by, carrying a great bag on his back. He saw the hare and stopped and asked why he was crying so loudly. But the poor hare, remembering that he had been deceived by one very like the man who now spoke to him, did not answer, but continued to cry. But this man had a kind heart, and looked at the hare very pityingly, and said, "You poor thing, I see that your fur is all pulled out, and that your skin is quite bare. Who could have treated you so cruelly?" When the hare heard these kind words, he felt very grateful to the man, and encouraged by his gentle manner, the hare told him all that had befallen him. The little animal hid nothing from his friend, but told him frankly how he had played a trick on the crocodiles, and how he had come across the bridge they had made, thinking that he wished to count their number, how he had jeered at them for their stupidity, and then how the crocodiles had revenged themselves on him. Then he went on to say how he had been deceived by a party of men who looked very like his kind friend, and the hare ended his long tale of woe by begging the man to give him some medicine that would cure him and make his fur grow again. When the hare had finished his story, the man was full of pity towards him, and said, "I am very sorry for all you have suffered, but remember, it was only the consequence of the deceit you practiced on the crocodiles." "I know," answered the sorrowful hare, "but I have repented and made up my mind never to use deceit again, so I beg you to show me how I may cure my sore body and make the fur grow again." "Then I will tell you of a good remedy," said the man. "First go and bathe well in that pond over there, and try to wash all the salt from your body. Then pick some of those kaba flowers that are growing near the edge of the water, spread them on the ground, and roll yourself on them. If you do this, the pollen will cause your fur to grow again, and you will be quite well in a little while." The hare was very glad to be told what to do so kindly. He crawled to the pond pointed out to him, bathed well in it, and then picked the kaba flowers growing near the water and rolled himself on them. To his amazement, even while he was doing this, he saw his nice white fur growing again. The pain ceased, and he felt just as he had done before all his misfortunes. The hare was overjoyed at his quick recovery, and went hopping joyfully towards the young man who had so helped him, and kneeling down at his feet, said, "I cannot express my thanks for all you have done for me. It is my earnest wish to do something for you in return. Please tell me who you are." "I am no king's son as you think me. I am a fairy, and my name is Okuni Nushi no Mikoto," answered the man. "And those beings who passed here before me are my brothers. They have heard of a beautiful princess called Yakami who lives in this province of Inaba, and they are on their way to find her and ask her to marry one of them. But on this expedition I am only an attendant, so I am walking behind them with this great big bag on my back." The hare humbled himself before this great fairy, Okuni Nushi no Mikoto, whom many in that part of the land worshipped as a god. "Oh, I did not know that you were Okuni Nushi no Mikoto. How kind you have been to me. It is impossible to believe that the unkind fellow who sent me to bathe in the sea is one of your brothers. I am quite sure that the princess, whom your brothers have gone to seek, will refuse to be the bride of any of them, and will prefer you for your goodness of heart. I am quite sure that you will win her heart without intending to do so, and that she will ask to be your bride." Okuni Nushi no Mikoto took no notice of what the hare said, but bidding the little animal goodbye, went on his way quickly and soon overtook his brothers. He found them just entering the princess's gate. Just as the hare had said, the princess could not be persuaded to become the bride of any of the brothers, but when she looked at the kind brother's face, she went straight up to him and said, "To you I give myself." And so they were married. This is the end of the story. Okuni Nushi no Mikoto is worshipped by the people in some parts of Japan as a god, and the hare has become famous as the white hare of Inaba. But what became of the crocodiles, nobody knows. The end. The White Doe by the Countess Dolnoy. Once upon a time there lived a king and queen who loved each other dearly and would have been perfectly happy if they had only had a little son or daughter to play with. They never talked about it and always pretended that there was nothing in the world to wish for, but sometimes when they looked at other people's children, their faces grew sad and their courtiers and attendants knew the reason why. One day the queen was sitting alone by the side of a waterfall which sprung from some rocks in the large park adjoining the castle. She was feeling more than usually miserable and had sent away her ladies so that no one might witness her grief. Suddenly she heard a rustling movement in the pool below the waterfall, and on glancing up, she saw a large crab climbing onto a stone beside her. "Great Queen," said the crab, "I am here to tell you that the desire of your heart will soon be granted. But first you must permit me to lead you to the palace of the fairies, which, though hard by, has never been seen by mortal eyes because of the thick clouds that surround it. When there, you will know more. That is, if you will trust yourself to me." The Queen had never before heard an animal speak and was struck dumb with surprise. However, she was so enchanted at the words of the crab that she smiled sweetly and held out her hand. It was taken, not by the crab, which had stood there only a moment before, but by a little old woman smartly dressed in white and crimson, with green ribbons in her grey hair. And wonderful to say, not a drop of water fell from her clothes. The old woman ran lightly down a path along which the Queen had been 100 times before, but it seemed so different she could hardly believe it was the same. Instead of having to push her way through nettles and brambles, roses and jasmine hung about her head, while under her feet the ground was sweet with violets. The orange trees were so tall and thick that even at midday the sun was never too hot, and at the end of the path was a glimmer of something so dazzling that the Queen had to shade her eyes and peep at it only between her fingers. "What can it be?" she asked, turning to her guide, who answered, "Oh, that is the fairies' palace, and here are some of them coming to meet us." As she spoke, the gate swung back, and 6 fairies approached, each bearing in her hand a flower made of precious stones, but so like a real one that it was only by touching you could tell the difference. "Madam," they said, "we know not how to thank you for this mark of your confidence, but have the happiness to tell you that in a short time you will have a little daughter." The Queen was so enchanted at this news that she nearly fainted with joy, but when she was able to speak, she poured out all her gratitude to the fairies for their promised gift. "And now," she said, "I ought not stay any longer, for my husband will think that I have run away, or that some evil beast has devoured me." In a little while it happened just as the fairies had foretold, and a baby girl was born in the palace. Of course, both the king and queen were delighted, and the child was called Desiree, which means desired, for she had been desired for 5 long years before her birth. At first the queen could think of nothing but her new plaything, but then she remembered the fairies who had sent it to her. Bidding her ladies bring her the posy of jewelled flowers which had been given her at the palace, she took each flower in her hand and called it by name, and in turn each fairy appeared before her. But as unluckily often happens, the one to whom she owed most, the crab fairy, was forgotten, and by this, as in the case of other babies you have read about, much mischief was wrought. However, for the moment all was gaiety in the palace, and everybody inside ran to the windows to watch the fairies' carriages, for no 2 were alike. One had a car of ebony drawn by white pigeons, another was lying back in her ivory chariot, driving 10 black crows, while the rest had chosen rare woods or many-coloured seashells, with scarlet and blue macaws, long-tailed peacocks, or green lovebirds for horses. These carriages were only used on occasion of state, for when they went to war, flying dragons, fiery serpents, lions or leopards took the place of beautiful birds. The fairies entered the queen's chamber, followed by little dwarfs, who carried their presents and looked much prouder than their mistresses. One by one their burdens were spread upon the ground, and no one had ever seen such lovely things. Everything that a baby could possibly wear or play was there, and besides, they had other and more precious gifts to give her, which only children who have fairies for godmothers can ever hope to possess. They were all gathered around the heap of pink cushions on which the baby lay asleep, when a shadow seemed to fall between them and the sun, while a cold wind blew through the room. Everybody looked up, and there was the crab fairy, who had grown as tall as the ceiling in her anger. "So I am forgotten," cried she, in a voice so loud that the queen trembled as she heard it. "Who was it soothed you in your trouble? Who was it led you to the fairies? Who was it brought you back in safety to your home again? Yet I am overlooked, while these who have done nothing in comparison are petted and thanked." The queen, almost dumb with terror, in vain tried to think of some explanation or apology, but there was none, and she could only confess her fault and implore forgiveness. The fairies also did their best to soften the wrath of their sister, and knowing that, like many plain people who are not fairies, she was very vain, they entreated her to drop her crab's disguise and to become once more the charming person they were accustomed to see. For some time the enraged fairy would listen to nothing, but at length the flatteries began to take effect. The crab's shell fell from her, she shrank into her usual size, and lost some of her fierce expression. "Well," she said, "I will not cause the princess's death as I had meant to do, but at the same time she will have to bear the punishment of her mother's fault, as many other children have done before her. The sentence I pass upon her is that if she is allowed to see one ray of daylight before her 15th birthday, she will rue it bitterly, and it may perhaps cost her her life." And with these words she vanished by the window through which she came, while the fairies comforted the weeping queen and took counsel how best the princess might be kept safe during her childhood. At the end of half an hour they had made up their minds what to do, and at the command of the fairies a beautiful palace sprung up, close to that of the king and queen, but different from every other palace in the world, in having no windows and only a door right under the earth. However, once within, daylight was hardly missed, so brilliant were the multitudes of tapers that were burning on the walls. Now up to this time the princess's history has been like the history of many a princess that you have read about, but when the period of her imprisonment was nearly over, her fortunes took another turn. For almost 15 years the fairies had taken care of her, and amused her, and taught her, so that when she came into the world she might be no whit behind the daughters of other kings in all that makes a princess charming and accomplished. They all loved her dearly, but the fairy Tulip loved her most of all, and as the princess's 15th birthday drew near, the fairy began to tremble lest something terrible should happen, some accident which had not been foreseen. "Do not let her out of your sight," said Tulip to the queen, "and meanwhile let her portrait be painted and carried to the neighbouring courts, as is the custom, in order that the kings may see how far her beauty exceeds that of every other princess, and that they may demand her in marriage for their sons." And so it was done, and as the fairy had prophesied, all the young princes fell in love with the picture, but the last one to whom it was shown could think of nothing else, and refused to let it be removed from his chamber, where he spent whole days gazing at it. The king his father was much surprised at the change which had come over his son, who generally passed all his time in hunting or hawking, and his anxiety was increased by a conversation he overheard between two of his courtiers, that they feared the prince must be going out of his mind, so moody had he become. Without losing a moment, the king went to visit his son, and no sooner had he entered the room than the young man flung himself at his father's feet. "You have betrothed me already to a bride I can never love," cried he. "But if you will not consent to break off the match and ask for the hand of the Princess Desiree, I shall die of misery, thankful to be alive no longer." These words much displeased the king, who felt that, in breaking off the marriage already arranged, he would almost certainly be bringing on his subjects a long and bloody war. So, without answering, he turned away, hoping that a few days might bring his son to reason. But the prince's condition grew rapidly so much worse that the king, in despair, promised to send an embassy at once to Desiree's father. This news cured the young man in an instant of all his ills, and he began to plan out every detail of dress and of horses and carriages which were necessary to make the train of the envoy, whose name was Becasig, as splendid as possible. He longed to form part of the embassy himself, if only in the disguise of a page, but this the king would not allow, and so the prince had to content himself with searching the kingdom for everything that was rare and beautiful to send the princess. Indeed, he arrived just as the embassy was starting, with his portrait, which had been painted in secret by the court painter. The king and queen wished for nothing better than that their daughter should marry into such a great and powerful family, and received the ambassador with every sign of welcome. They even wished him to see the Princess Desiree, but this was prevented by the fairy Tulip, who feared some ill might come of it. "And be sure you tell him," added she, "that the marriage cannot be celebrated until she is 15 years old, or else some terrible misfortune will happen to the child." So when Becasig, surrounded by his train, made a formal request that the Princess Desiree might be given in marriage to his master's son, the king replied that he was much honoured, and he would gladly give his consent, but that no one could even see the princess until her 15th birthday, as the spell laid upon her in the cradle by a spiteful fairy would not cease to work till that was past. The ambassador was greatly surprised and disappointed, but he knew too much about fairies to venture to disobey them. Therefore he had to content himself with presenting the prince's portrait to the queen, who lost no time in carrying it to the princess. As the girl took it in her hands, it suddenly spoke, as it had been taught to do, and uttered a compliment of the most delicate and charming sort, which made the princess flush with pleasure. "How would you like to have a husband like that?" asked the queen, laughing. "As if I knew anything about husbands," replied Desiree, who had long ago guessed the business of the ambassador. "Well, he will be your husband in 3 months," answered the queen, ordering the prince's presents to be brought in. The princess was very pleased with them and admired them greatly, but the queen noticed that all the while her eyes constantly strayed from the softest silks and the most brilliant jewels to the portrait of the prince. The ambassador, finding that there was no hope of his being allowed to see the princess, took his leave and returned to his own court, but here a new difficulty appeared. The prince, though transported with joy at the thought that Desiree was indeed to be his bride, was bitterly disappointed that she had not been allowed to return with Becasigue, as he had foolishly expected, and never having been taught to deny himself anything or to control his feelings, he fell as ill as he had done the day before. He would eat nothing, nor take pleasure in anything, but lay all day on a heap of cushions, gazing at the picture of the princess. "If I have to wait 3 months before I can marry the princess, I shall die," was all this spoilt boy would say. And at length the king, in despair, resolved to send a fresh embassy to Desiree's father to implore him to permit the marriage to be celebrated at once. "I would have presented my prayer in person," he added in his letter, "but my great age and infirmities do not suffer me to travel. However, my envoy has orders to agree to any arrangement that you may propose." On his arrival at the palace, Becasigue pleaded his young master's cause as fervently as the king, his father, could have done, and entreated that the princess might be consulted in the matter. The queen hastened to the marble tower and told her daughter of the sad state of the prince. Desiree sank down fainting at the news, but soon came to herself again, and set about inventing a plan which would enable her to go to the prince without risking the doom pronounced over her by the wicked fairy. "I see," she exclaimed joyfully at last. "Let a carriage be built through which no light can come, and let it be brought into my room. I will then get into it, and we can travel swiftly during the night and arrive before dawn at the palace of the prince. Once there, I can remain in some underground chamber where no light can come." "Ah, how clever you are!" cried the queen, clasping her in her arms, and she hurried away to tell the king. "What a wife our prince will have," said Becasigue, bowing low, "but I must hasten back with the tidings and to prepare the underground chamber for the princess." And so he took his leave. In a few days the carriage commanded by the princess was ready. It was of green velvet, scattered over with large golden thistles, and lined inside with a silver brocade embroidered with pink roses. It had no windows, of course, but the fairy Tulip, whose counsel had been asked, had managed to light it up with a soft glow that came no one knew whither. It was carried straight up to the great hall of the tower, and the princess stepped into it, followed by her faithful maid of honour, Eglantine, and by her lady-in-waiting, Cerisette, who had also fallen in love with the prince's portrait and was bitterly jealous of her mistress. The 4th place in the carriage was filled by Cerisette's mother, who had been sent by the queen to look after the 3 young people. Now the fairy of the fountain was the godmother of the princess Nera, to whom the prince had been betrothed before the picture of Desiree had made him faithless. She was very angry at the slight put upon her godchild, and from that moment kept careful watch on the princess. In this journey she saw her chance, and it was she who, invisible, sat by Cerisette and put bad thoughts into the mind of both her and her mother. The way to the city where the prince lived ran for the most part through a thick forest, and every night there was no moon, not a single star could be seen through the trees. The guards who travelled with the princess opened the carriage to give it an airing. This went on for several days, till only 12 hours' journey lay between them and the palace. Then Cerisette persuaded her mother to cut a great hole in the side of the carriage with a sharp knife, which she herself had brought for the purpose. In the forest the darkness was so intense that no one perceived what she had done, but when they left the last trees behind them and emerged into the open country, the sun was up, and for the first time since her babyhood, Desiree found herself in the light of day. She looked up in surprise at the dazzling brilliance that streamed through the hole, and then gave a sigh which seemed to come from her heart. The carriage door swung back as if by magic, and a white doe sprung out, and in the moment was lost in sight in the forest. But as quick as she was, Eglantine, her maid of honour, had time to see where she went, and jumped from the carriage in pursuit of her, followed at a distance by the guards. Cerisette and her mother looked at each other in surprise and joy. They could hardly believe their good fortune, for everything had happened exactly as they wished. The first thing to be done was to conceal the hole which had been cut, and when this was managed, with the help of the angry fairy, though they did not know it, Cerisette hastened to take off her own clothes and put on those of the princess, placing the crown of diamonds on her head. She found this heavier than she expected, but then she had never been accustomed to wear crowns, which makes all the difference. At the gates of the city, the carriage was stopped by a guard of honour sent by the king as an escort to his son's bride. Though Cerisette and her mother could of course see nothing of what was going on outside, they heard plainly the shouts of welcome from the crowds along the streets. The carriage stopped at length in the vast hall which Becasig had prepared for the reception of the princess. The Grand Chamberlain and the Lord High Steward were waiting her, and when the false bride stepped into the brilliantly lighted room, they bowed low and said they had orders to inform His Highness the moment she arrived. The prince, whom the strict etiquette of the court had prevented from being present in the underground hall, was burning with impatience in his own apartments. "So she has come," cried he, throwing down the bow he had been pretending to mend. "Well, was I not right? Is she not a miracle of beauty and grace? And has she her equal in the whole world?" The ministers looked at each other and made no reply, till at length the chamberlain, who was the bolder of the two, observed, "My lord, as to her beauty, you can be the judge of that yourself. No doubt it is as great as you say, but at present it seems to have suffered, as is natural, from the fatigues of the journey." This was certainly not what the prince had expected to hear. Could the portrait have flattered her? He had known of such things before, and a cold shiver ran through him, but with an effort he kept silent from further questioning, and only said, "Has the king been told that the princess is in the palace?" "Yes, your highness, and he has probably already joined her." "Then I will go too," said the prince. Weak as he was from his long illness, the prince descended the staircase, supported by the ministers, and entered the room just in time to hear his father's loud cry of astonishment and disgust at the sight of Cerisette. "There has been treachery at work," he exclaimed, while the prince leant, dumb with horror, against the doorpost. But the lady-in-waiting, who had been prepared for something of the sort, advanced, holding in her hand the letters which the king and queen had entrusted to her. "This is the Princess Desiree," she said, pretending to have heard nothing, "and I have the honour to present you with these letters from my liege lord and lady, together with the casket containing the princess's jewels." The king did not move or answer her, so the prince, leaning on the arm of Becasig, approached a little closer to the false princess, hoping against hope that his eyes had deceived him. But the longer he looked, the more he agreed with his father that there was some treason somewhere, for in no single respect did the portrait resemble the woman before him. Cerisette was so tall that the dress of the princess did not reach her ankles, and so thin that her bones showed through the stuff. Besides that, her nose was hooked, and her teeth black and ugly. In his turn, the prince stood rooted to the spot. At last he spoke, and his words were addressed to his father and not to the bride who had come so far to marry him. "We have been deceived," he said, "and it will cost me my life." And he leaned so heavily on the envoy that Becasig feared he was going to faint, and hastily laid him on the floor. For some minutes no one could attend to anybody but the prince, but as soon as he revived, the lady-in-waiting made herself heard. "Oh, my lovely princess, why did we ever leave home?" cried she. "But the king your father will avenge the insults that have been heaped on you when we tell him how you have been treated." "I will tell him myself," replied the king in wrath. "He promised me a wonder of beauty. He has sent me a skeleton. I'm not surprised he has kept her for 15 years hidden from the eyes of the world. Take them both away," he continued, turning to his guards, "and lodge them in the state prison. There is something more I have to learn of the matter." His orders were obeyed, and the prince, loudly bewailing his sad fate, was led back to his bed, where for many days he lay in a high fever. At length he slowly began to gain strength, but his sorrow was still so great that he could not bear the sight of a strange face, and shuddered at the notion of taking his proper part in the court ceremonies. Unknown to the king or to anybody but Becasig, he planned that, as soon as he was able, he would make his escape and pass the rest of his life in some solitary place. It was some weeks before he had regained his health sufficiently to carry out his design, but finally, one beautiful starlit night, the two friends stole away, and when the king woke the next morning he found a letter lying by his bed, saying that his son had gone, he knew not whither. He wept bitter tears at the news, for he loved the prince dearly, but he felt that perhaps the young man had done wisely, and he trusted to time and Beccasig's influence to bring the wanderer home. And while these things were happening, what had become of the white doe? Though when she sprang from the carriage she was aware that some unkind fate had changed her into an animal, yet still she saw herself in a stream. She had no idea what it was. "Is it really I, Desiree?" she said to herself, weeping. "What wicked fairy can have treated me so? And I shall never, never take my own shape again. My only comfort that, in this great forest full of lions and serpents, my life will be a short one." Now the fairy Tulip was as much grieved at the sad fate of the princess as Desiree's own mother could have been if she had known of it. Still, she could not help feeling that if the king and queen had listened to her advice, the girl would be by this time safely in the walls of her new home. However, she loved Desiree too much to let her suffer more than could be helped, and it was she who guided Eglantine to the place where the white doe was standing, cropping the grass, which was her dinner. At the sound of footsteps, the pretty creature lifted her head, and when she saw her faithful companion approaching, she bounded towards her and rubbed her head on Eglantine's shoulder. The maid of honour was surprised, but she was fond of animals, and stroked the white doe tenderly, speaking gently to her all the while. Suddenly the beautiful creature lifted her head and looked up into Eglantine's face, with tears streaming from her eyes. A thought flashed through her mind. As quick as lightning, the girl flung herself on her knees, and lifting the animal's feet, kissed them one by one. "My princess! Oh, my dear princess!" cried she, and again the white doe rubbed her head against her, for though the spiteful fairy had taken away her power of speech, she had not deprived her of her reason. All day long the two remained together, and when Eglantine grew hungry, she was led by the white doe to a part of the forest where pears and peaches grew in abundance. But as night came on, the maid of honour was filled with the terrors of the wild beasts which had beset the princess during her first night in the forest. "Is there no hut or cave we could go into?" asked she, but the doe only shook her head, and the two sat down and wept with fright. The fairy Tulip, who, in spite of her anger, was very soft-hearted, was touched at their distress, and quickly flew to their help. "I cannot take away the spell altogether," she said, "for the fairy of the fountain is stronger than I, but I can shorten the time of your punishment, and am able to make it less hard, for as soon as darkness falls, you shall resume your own shape." To think that by the by she would cease to be a white doe, indeed that she would at once cease to be one during the night, was for the present joy enough for Desiree, and she skipped about on the grass in the prettiest manner. "Go straight down the path in front of you," continued the fairy, smiling as she watched her. "Go straight down the path, and you will soon reach a little hut where you will find shelter." And with these words she vanished, leaving her hearers happier than they had ever thought they would be again. An old woman was standing at the door of the hut when Eglantine drew near, and with the white doe trotting by her side. "Good evening," she said. "Could you give me a night's lodging for myself and my doe?" "Certainly I can," replied the old woman, and she led them into a room with two little white beds, so clean and comfortable that it made you sleepy even to look at them. The door had hardly closed behind the old woman when the sun sank below the horizon, and Desiree became a girl again. "Oh, Eglantine, what should I have done with you if you had not followed me?" she cried, and she flung herself into her friend's arms in a transport of delight. Early in the morning, Eglantine was awakened by the sound of somebody scratching at the door, and on opening her eyes she saw the white doe struggling to get out. The little creature looked up and into her face and nodded her head as the maid of honour unfastened the latch, but bounded away into the woods and was lost to sight in a moment. Meanwhile, the prince and Becasig were wandering through the wood, till at last the prince grew so tired that he lay down under a tree and told Becasig that he had better go in search of food and of some place where they could sleep. Becasig had not gone very far when a turn of the path brought him face to face with the old woman who was feeding her doves before her cottage. "Could you give me some milk and fruit?" asked he. "I'm very hungry myself, and besides I've left a friend behind me who is still weak from illness." "Certainly I can," answered the old woman, "but come and sit down in my kitchen while I catch the goat and milk it." Becasig was glad enough to do as he was bid, and in a few minutes the old woman returned with a basket brimming over with oranges and grapes. "If your friend has been ill, he should not pass the night in the forest," said she. "I have a room in my hut, tiny enough, it is true, but better than nothing, and to that which you are both heartily welcome." Becasigue thanked her warmly, and by this time it was almost sunset. He set out to fetch the prince. It was while he was absent that Eglantine and the white doe entered the hut, and having, of course, no idea that in the very next room was the man whose childish impatience had been the cause of all their troubles. In spite of his fatigue, the prince slept badly, and directly it was light, he rose, and bidding Becasigue remain where he was, as he wished to be alone, he strolled out into the forest. He walked on slowly, just as his fancy led him, till suddenly he came to a wide open space, and in the middle was the white doe, quietly eating her breakfast. She bounded off at the sight of a man, but not before the prince, who had fastened on his bow without thinking, had let fly several arrows, which the fairy Tulip took care should do her no harm. But quickly as she ran, she soon felt her strength failing her, for 15 years of life in a tower had not taught her how to exercise her limbs. Luckily, the prince was too weak to follow her far, and in a turn of a path brought her close to the hut, where Eglantine was waiting for her. Panting for breath, she entered their room and flung herself down on the floor. When it was dark again, and she was once more the Princess Desiree, she told Eglantine what had befallen her. "I feared the fairy of the fountain and the cruel beasts," she said, "but somehow I never thought of the dangers that I ran from men. I do not know now what saved me." "You must stay quietly here till the time of your punishment is over," answered Eglantine. But when the morning dawned and the girl turned into a doe, the longing for the forest came over her, and she sprang away as before. As soon as the prince was awake, he hastened to the place where, only the day before, he had found the white doe feeding, but of course she had taken care to go in the opposite direction. Much disappointed, he tried first one green path and then another, and at last, wearied with walking, he threw himself down and went fast asleep. Just at this moment the white doe sprang out of the thicket nearby and started back trembling when she beheld her enemy lying there. Yet instead of turning to fly, something bade her go back and look at him unseen. As she gazed, a thrill ran through her, for she felt that, worn and wasted though he was by illness, it was the face of her destined husband. Gently stooping over him, she kissed his forehead, and at her touch he awoke. For a minute they looked at each other, and to his amazement he recognized the white doe which had escaped him the previous day. But in an instant the animal was aroused to a sense of her danger, and she fled with all her strength into the thickest part of the forest. Quick as lightning the prince was on her track, but this time it was with no wish to kill or even wound the beautiful creature. Pretty doe, stop, I won't hurt you," cried he, but his words were carried away by the wind. At length the doe could run no more, and when the prince reached her, she was lying stretched out on the grass, waiting for her death blow. But instead the prince knelt at her side and stroked her and bade her fear nothing, as he would take care of her. So he fetched a little water from the stream in his horn hunting cup. Then, cutting some branches from the trees, he twisted them into a litter, which he covered with moss, and laid the white doe gently on it. For a long time they remained thus, but when Desiree saw by the way that the light struck the trees that the sun must be near its setting, she was filled with alarm lest the darkness should fall, and the prince should behold her in the human shape. "No, he must not see me for the first time here," she thought, and instantly began to plan how to get rid of him. Then she opened her mouth and let her tongue hang out, as if she were dying of thirst, and the prince, as she expected, hastened to the stream to get her some more water. When he returned, the white doe was gone. That night Desiree confessed to Eglantine that her pursuer was no other than the prince, and that far from flattering him, the portrait had never done him any justice. "Is it not hard to meet him in this shape," wept she, "when we both love each other so much?" But Eglantine comforted her, and reminded her that in a short time all would be well. The prince was very angry at the flight of the white doe, for whom he had taken so much trouble, and returning to the cottage he poured out his adventures and his wrath to Becasigue, who could not help smiling. "She shall not escape me again," cried the prince. "If I hunt her every day for a year, I will have her at last." And in this frame of mind he went to bed. When the white doe entered the forest the next morning, she had not made up her mind whether she would go and meet the prince, or whether she would shun him and hide in the thickets of which she knew nothing. She decided that the last plan was the best, and so it would have been if the prince had not taken the very same direction in search of her. Quite by accident he caught sight of her white skin shining through the bushes, and at the same instant she heard a twig snap under his feet. In a moment she was up and away, but the prince, not knowing how else to capture her, aimed an arrow at her leg, which brought her to the ground. The young man felt like a murderer as he ran hastily up to where the white doe lay and did his best to soothe the pain she felt, which in reality was the last part of the punishment sent by the fairy of the fountain. First he brought her some water, and then he fetched her some healing herbs, and having crushed them in his hands, laid them on the wound. "Ah, what a wretch I was to have hurt you," cried he, resting her head upon his knees, "and now you will hate me and fly from me forever." For some time the doe lay quietly where she was, but as before she remembered that the hour of her transformation was near. She struggled to her feet, but the prince would not hear of her walking, and thinking the old woman might be able to dress her wound better than he could, he took her in his arms to carry her back to the hut. But small as she was, she made herself so heavy that after staggering a few steps under her weight, he laid her down and tied her fast to a tree with some of the ribbons off his hat. This done, he went away to get help. Meanwhile, Eglantine had grown very uneasy at the long absence of her mistress, and had come out to look for her. Just as the prince passed out of sight, the fluttering ribbons danced before her eyes, and she descried her beautiful princess bound to a tree. With all her might she worked at the knots, but not a single one could she undo, though all appeared so easy. She was still busy with them, when a voice behind her said, "Pardon me, fair lady, but it is my doe you are trying to steal." "Excuse me, good knight," answered Eglantine, hardly glancing at him, "but it is my doe that is tied up here, and if you wish for a proof of it, you can see if she knows me or not. Touch my heart, little one," she continued, dropping onto her knees, and the doe lifted up its forefoot and laid it on her side. "Now put your arms around my neck and sigh," and again the doe did as she was bid. "You are right," said the prince, "but it is with sorrow I give her up to you, for though I have wounded her yet, I love her deeply." To this Eglantine answered nothing, but carefully raising up the doe, she led her slowly to the hut. Now both the prince and Becasigue were quite unaware that the old woman had any guests beside themselves, and following afar were much surprised to behold Eglantine and her charge enter the cottage. They lost no time in questioning the old woman, who replied that she knew nothing about the lady and her white doe, who slept in the next chamber occupied by the prince and his friend, but that they were very quiet and paid her well. Then she went back to her kitchen. "Do you know," said Becasigue when they were alone, "I am certain that the lady we saw is the maid of honour to the Princess Desiree, whom I met at the palace. And as her room is next to this, it will be easy to make a small hole through which I can satisfy myself whether I am right or not." So taking a knife out of his pocket, he began to saw away at the woodwork. The girls heard the grating noise, but fancying it was a mouse, paid no attention, and Becasigue was left in peace to pursue his work. At length the hole was large enough for him to peep through, and the sight was one to strike him dumb with amazement. He had guessed truly the tall lady was Eglantine herself, but the other, where had he seen her? Ah, now he knew it was the lady of the portrait. Desiree, in a flowing dress of green silk, was lying stretched out upon cushions, and as Eglantine bent over her to bathe the wounded leg, she began to talk. "Oh, let me die," cried she, "rather than go on leading this life. You cannot tell the misery of being a beast all the day, and unable to speak to the man I love, and whose impatience I owe my cruel fate. Yet even so, I cannot bring myself to hate him." These words, low that they were spoken, reached Becasigue, who could hardly believe his ears. He stood silent for a moment, then, crossing to the window out of which the prince was gazing, he took his arm and led him across the room. A single glance was sufficient to show the prince that it was indeed Desiree, and how another had come to the palace bearing her name. At that instant he neither knew nor cared. Stealing on tiptoe from the room, he knocked at the next door, which was opened by Eglantine, who thought it was the old woman bearing their supper. She started back at the sight of the prince, whom this time she also recognized, but he thrust her aside and flung himself at the feet of Desiree, to whom he poured out all his heart. Dawn found them still conversing, and the sun was high in the heavens before the princess perceived that she retained her human form. Ah, how happy she was when she knew that the days of her punishment were over, and with a glad voice she told the prince the tale of her enchantment. So the story ended well after all, and the fairy Tulip, who turned out to be the old woman of the hut, made the young couple such a wedding feast as had never been seen since the world began. And everybody was delighted, except Cerisette and her mother, who were put in a boat and carried to a small island where they had to work hard for their living. The end.
The Three Dwarfs by Brothers Grimm. This is a vintage fairy tale and may contain violence. We would encourage parents to read beforehand if your child is sensitive to such themes. There was once upon a time a man who lost his wife, and a woman who lost her husband. And the man had a daughter, and so had the woman. The two girls were great friends, and used often to play together. One day the woman turned to the man's daughter and said, "Go and tell your father that I will marry him, and then you shall wash in milk and drink wine. But my own daughter shall wash in water and drink it too." The girl went straight home and told her father what the woman had said. "What am I to do?" he answered. "Marriage is either a success or it is a failure." At last, being of an undecided character, and not being able to make up his mind, he took off his boot, and handing it to his daughter said, "Take this boot which has a hole in the sole, hang it up on a nail in the hayloft, and pour water into it. If it holds water, I will marry again, but if it doesn't, I won't." The girl did as she was bid, but the water drew the hole together, and the boot filled up to the very top. So she went and told her father the result. He got up and went to see for himself, and when he saw that it was true, and no mistake, he accepted his fate, proposed to the widow, and they were married at once. On the morning after the wedding, when the two girls awoke, milk was standing for the man's daughter to wash in, and wine for her to drink. But the woman's daughter, only water to wash in and only water to drink. On the second morning, water to wash in and water to drink was standing for the man's daughter as well. And on the third morning, water to wash in and water to drink was standing for the man's daughter, and milk to wash in and wine to drink for the woman's daughter. And so it continued ever after. The woman hated her stepdaughter from the bottom of her heart, and did all she could to make her life miserable. She was as jealous as she could possibly be, because the girl was so beautiful and charming, while her own daughter was both ugly and repulsive. One winter's day, when there was a hard frost, and mountain and valley were covered with snow, the woman made a dress of paper, and calling the girl to her, she said, "There, put on this dress and go out into the wood and fetch me a basket of strawberries." "Now, heaven help us," replied the stepdaughter. "Strawberries don't grow in the winter. The earth is all frozen and the snow has covered up everything. And why send me in a paper dress? It's so cold outside that one's very breath freezes. The wind will whistle through my dress, and the brambles tear it from my body." "How dare you contradict me?" said her stepmother. "Be off with you at once, and don't show your face again till you have filled the basket with strawberries." Then she gave her a hard crust of bread, saying, "That will be enough for you today." And she thought to herself, "The girl will certainly perish of hunger and cold outside, and I shan't be bothered with her any more." The girl was so obedient that she put on the paper dress and set out with her little basket. There was nothing but snow far and near, and not a green blade of grass to be seen anywhere. When she came to the wood, she saw a little house, and out of it popped 3 little dwarfs. She wished them good day and knocked modestly at the door. They called out to her to enter, so she stepped in and sat down on a seat by the fire, wishing to warm herself and eat her breakfast. The dwarfs said at once, "Give us some of your food." "Gladly," she said, and breaking her crust in two, she gave them the half. Then they asked her what she was doing in the depths of winter in her thin dress. "Oh," she answered, "I have been sent out to get a basket full of strawberries, and I daren't show my face again at home till I bring them with me." When she had finished her bread, they gave her a broom and told her to sweep away the snow from the back door. As soon as she left the room to do so, the 3 little men consulted what they should give her as a reward for being so sweet and good, and for sharing her last crust with them. The first said, "Every day she shall grow prettier." The second, "Every time she opens her mouth, a piece of gold shall fall out." And the third, "A king shall come and marry her." The girl in the meantime was doing as the dwarfs had bidden her, and was sweeping the snow away from the back door. And what do you think she found there? Heaps of fine strawberries that showed out dark red against the white snow. She joyfully picked enough to fill her basket, thanked the little men for their kindness, shook hands with them, and ran home to bring her stepmother what she had asked for. When she walked in and said good evening, a piece of gold fell out of her mouth. Then she told what had happened to her in the wood, and at every word pieces of gold dropped from her mouth, so that the room was soon covered with them.
"She's surely more money than wit to throw gold about like that,"
said her stepsister. But in her secret heart she was very jealous, and determined that she too would go to the wood and look for strawberries. But her mother refused to let her go, saying, "My dear child, it is far too cold. You might freeze to death." The girl, however, left her no peace, so she was forced at last to give in. But she insisted on her putting on a beautiful fur cloak, and she gave her bread and butter and cakes to eat on the way. The girl went straight to the little house in the wood, and as before, the three little men were looking out of the window. She took no notice of them, and without as much as a "by your leave" or "with your leave," she flounced into the room, sat herself down at the fire, and began to eat her bread and butter and cakes.
"Give us some," cried the dwarfs. But she answered, "No, I won't. It's hardly enough for myself, so catch me giving you any." When she had finished eating, they said, "There's a broom for you. Go and clear up our back door." "I'll see myself further," she answered rudely. "Do it yourselves. I'm not your servant." When she saw that they did not mean to give her anything, she left the house in no amiable frame of mind. Then the three little men consulted what they should do to her, because she was so bad and had such an evil, covetous heart that she grudged everybody their good fortune. The first said, "She shall grow uglier every day." The second, "Every time she speaks, a toad shall jump out of her mouth." And the third, "She shall die a most miserable death." The girl searched for strawberries, but she found none, and returned home in a very bad temper. When she opened her mouth to tell her mother what had befallen her in the wood, a toad jumped out, so that everyone was quite disgusted with her. Then the stepmother was more furious than ever, and did nothing but plot mischief against the man's daughter, who was daily growing more and more beautiful. At last, one day the wicked woman took a large pot, put it on the fire, and boiled some yarn in it. When it was well scalded, she hung it round the poor girl's shoulder, and giving her an axe, she bade her break a hole in the frozen river, and rinse the yarn in it. Her stepdaughter obeyed as usual, and went out and broke a hole in the ice. When she was in the act of wringing out the yarn, a magnificent carriage passed, and the king sat inside. The carriage stood still, and the king asked her, "My child, who are you, and what in the wide world are you doing here?" I am only a poor girl," she answered, "and am rinsing out my yarn in the river." And then the king was sorry for her, and when he saw how beautiful she was, he said, "Will you come away with me?" "Most gladly," she replied, for she knew how willingly she would leave her stepmother and sister, and how glad they would be to be rid of her. So she stepped into the carriage and drove away with the king, and when they reached his palace, the wedding was celebrated with much splendor. So all turned out just as the three little dwarfs had said. After a year, the queen gave birth to a little son. When her stepmother heard of her good fortune, she came to the palace with her daughter by way of paying a call, and took up her abode there. Now, one day when the king was out, and nobody else near, the bad woman took the queen by her head, and the daughter took her by her heels, and they dragged her from her bed, and flung her out of the window into the stream which flowed beneath it.
Then the stepmother laid her ugly daughter in the queen's place and covered her up with the clothes, so that nothing of her was seen. When the king came home and wished to speak to his wife, the woman called out, "Quietly, quietly, this will never do. Your wife is very ill. You must let her rest all today." The king suspected no evil and didn't come again till next morning. When he spoke to his wife and she answered him, instead of the usual piece of gold, a toad jumped out of her mouth. Then he asked what it meant, and the old woman told him it was nothing but weakness, and that she would soon be all right again. But that same evening, the scullion noticed a duck swimming up the gutter, saying as it passed,
"What does the king, I pray you, tell? Is he awake or sleeps he well?"
And receiving no reply, it continued,
"And all my guests, are they asleep?"
And the scullion answered, "Yes, one and all they slumber deep." Then the duck went on,
"And what about my baby dear?"
and he answered, "Oh, it sleeps soundly, never fear." Then the duck assumed the queen's shape, went up to the child's room, tucked him up comfortably in his cradle, and then swam back down the gutter again, in the likeness of a duck. This was repeated for 2 nights, and on the 3rd the duck said to the scullion,
"Go and tell the king to swing his sword 3 times over me on the threshold."
The scullion did as the creature bade him, and the king came with his sword and swung it 3 times over the bird, and lo and behold, his wife stood before him once more, alive and as blooming as ever. The king rejoiced greatly, but he kept the queen in hiding till the Sunday on which the child was to be christened. After the christening he said, "What punishment does that person deserve who drags another out of bed, and throws him or her, as the case may be, into the water?" Then the wicked old stepmother answered, "No better fate than to be put into a barrel and to be rolled in it down the hill into the water." "You have pronounced your own doom," said the king. And he ordered a barrel, and in it he put the bad old woman and her daughter. Then the barrel was rolled down the hill till it fell into the river.
The Fair with Golden Hair by the Countess d'Aulnoy. Once upon a time there was a king's daughter who was so handsome there was nothing in the world to be compared to her for beauty. And she was called the Fair with Golden Hair because her locks were like the finest gold, marvellously bright, and falling all in ringlets to her feet. She always appeared with her hair flowing in curls about her, crowned with flowers, and her dresses embroidered with diamonds and pearls. However it might be, it was impossible to see her without loving her. There was a young king amongst her neighbours who was unmarried, very handsome and very rich. When he heard all that was said about the Fair with Golden Hair, although he had never seen her, he fell so deeply in love with her that he could neither eat nor drink, and therefore resolved to send an ambassador to ask her hand in marriage. He had a magnificent coach made for this ambassador, gave him upwards of 100 horses and as many servants, and charged him particularly not to return without the princess. From the moment that the envoy had taken leave of the king, the whole court talked of nothing else, and the king, who never doubted that the Fair with Golden Hair would consent to his proposal, ordered immediately fine dresses and splendid furniture to be prepared for her. While the workmen were hard at work, the ambassador arrived at the fair one's court and delivered his little message, but whether she was that day out of temper, or that the compliment was not agreeable to her, she answered the ambassador that she thanked the king but had no inclination to marry. The ambassador quitted the court of the princess very low-spirited at not being able to bring her with him. He carried back all the presents he had been the bearer of from the king, for the princess was very prudent and was perfectly aware that young ladies should never receive gifts from bachelors, so she declined accepting the beautiful diamonds and the other valuable articles, and only retained, in order not to affront the king, 1/4 pound of English pins. When the ambassador reached the capital city of the king, where he was so impatiently awaited, everybody was afflicted that he did not bring back with him the fair with golden hair, and the king began to cry like a child. They endeavoured to console him, but without the least success. There was a youth at court who was as beautiful as the sun, and had the finest figure in the kingdom. On account of his graceful manners and his intelligence, he was called Avenant. Everybody loved him, except the envious, who were vexed that the king conferred favours upon him and daily confided to him in his affairs. Avenant was in the company with some persons who were talking of the return of the ambassador and saying he had done no good. "If the king had sent me to the fair with golden hair," said he to them carelessly, "I am certain she would have returned with me." These mischief-makers went immediately to the king and said, "Sire, you know not what Avenant asserts, that if you had sent him to the fair with golden hair, he would have brought her back with him. Observe his malice. He pretends that he is handsomer than you, and that she would have been so fond of him that she would have followed him anywhere." At this the king flew into a rage so terrible that he was quite beside himself. "Ha, ha," he cried, "this pretty minion laughs at my misfortune and values himself above me. Go, fling him into the great tower and let him starve to death." The royal guards hastened in search of Avenant, who had quite forgotten what he had said. They dragged him to prison, inflicting 1,000 injuries upon him. The poor youth had only a little straw to lie upon, and would soon have perished but for a tiny spring that trickled through the foundations of the tower, and of which he drank a few drops to refresh himself, his mouth being parched with thirst. One day, when he was quite exhausted, he exclaimed with a heavy sigh, "What does the king complain of? He has not a subject more loyal than I am, and I have never done anything to offend him." The king by chance passed close to the tower, and hearing the voice of one he had loved so dearly, he stopped to listen, notwithstanding those who were with him, who hated Avenant, and said to the king, "What interests you, sire? Do you not know he's a rogue?" The king replied, "Leave me alone. I would hear what he has to say." Having listened to his complaints, the tears stood in his eyes. He opened the door of the tower and called to the prisoner. Avenant came and knelt before him in deep sorrow and kissed his feet. "What have I done, sire, that I am thus severely treated?" "You have made game of me and of my ambassador," answered the king. "You have boasted that if I sent you to the fair with golden hair, you would certainly have brought her back with you." "It is true, sire," rejoined Avenant, "that I should have so impressed her with the sense of your majesty's high qualities that I feel persuaded she could not have refused you. And in saying that, sire, I uttered nothing that could be disagreeable to you." The king saw clearly that Avenant was innocent. He cast an angry look upon the people who had undermined his favourite and brought him away with him, sincerely repenting the wrong he had done to him. After giving him an excellent supper, he called him into his cabinet and said to him, "Avenant, I still love the fair with golden hair. Her refusal has not discouraged me, but I know not what course to take to induce her to marry me. I am tempted to send you to her to see if you could succeed." Avenant replied that he was ready to obey him in everything, and that he would set out the next day. "Hold," said the king, "I would give you a splendid team." "It is unnecessary," answered Avenant. "I need only a good horse and letters of credence from your majesty." The king embraced him, for he was so delighted to find him prepared to start so quickly. It was on a Monday morning that he took leave of the king and of his friends to proceed on the embassy, quite alone and without pomp or noise. His mind was occupied solely with schemes to induce the fair with golden hair to marry the king. He had a writing case in his pocket, and when a happy idea occurred to him for his introductory address, he alighted from his steed and seated himself under the trees to commit it to paper, so that he might not forget anything. The next morning that he had set out at the first peep of day, in passing through a large meadow, a charming idea came into his head. He dismounted and seated himself beside some willows and poplars which were planted along the bank of a little river that ran by the edge of the meadow. After he had made his note, he looked about him, delighted to find himself in so beautiful a spot. He perceived on the grass a large gilded carp, gasping and nearly exhausted, for in trying to catch some little flies, it had leaped so far out of the water that it had fallen on the grass and was all but dead. Avenant took pity upon it, and, although it was a fast day, and he might have carried it off for his dinner, he picked it up and put it gently back into the river. As soon as my friend the carp felt the freshness of the water, she began to recover herself and glided down to the very bottom, then rising again joyously to the bank of the stream. "Avenant," said she, "I thank you for your kindness that you have done me, but for you I should have died. You have saved me. I will do as much for you." After this little compliment, she darted down again into the water, leaving Avenant much surprised at her intelligence and great civility. Another day, as he continued his journey, he saw a crow in great distress. The poor bird was pursued by a large eagle, a great devourer of crows, which had nearly caught it, and would have swallowed it like a lentil if Avenant had not felt compassion for its misfortune. "Thus," he cried, "do the strong oppress the weak. What right has the eagle to eat the crow?" He seized his bow and arrow, which he always carried with him, and taking a good aim at the eagle, whiz, he sent the shaft right through its body. It fell dead, and the crow, enraptured, came and perched on a tree. "Avenant," it cried to him, "it was very generous of you thus to succour me, I who am only a poor crow, but I will not be ungrateful. I will do as much for you." Avenant admired the good sense of the crow and resumed his journey. Entering a large wood so early in the morning that there was scarcely light enough for him to see his road, he heard an owl screeching, like an owl in despair. "Heyday," said he, "here's an owl in great affliction. It has been caught, perhaps, in some net." He searched on all sides, and at last discovered some large nets, which had been spread by fowlers during the night to catch small birds. "What a pity," said he, "that men are only made to torment each other, or to persecute poor animals which do them no wrong or mischief." He drew his knife and cut the cords. The owl took flight, but returning swiftly on the wing, "Avenant," it cried, "it is needless for me to make a long speech to enable you to comprehend the obligation I am under to you. It speaks plainly enough for itself. The hunters would soon have been here. If I had been taken, I had been dead, but for your assistance. I have a grateful heart. I will do as much for you." These were the 3 most important adventures which befell Avenant on his journey. He was so eager to reach the end of it that he lost no time in repairing to the palace of the Fair with Golden Hair. Everything about it was admirable. There were diamonds to be seen in heaps, as though they were pebbles. Fine clothes, sweetmeats, money, the most wonderful sight that was ever seen, and Avenant thought in his heart, if he could persuade the princess to leave all this to go to the king, his master, he should be very lucky indeed. He dressed himself in a suit of brocade, with a plume of carnation and white feathers, combed and powdered himself, and washed his face, put a little richly embroidered scarf around his neck, with a little basket, and in it a beautiful little dog which he had brought as he came through Bologna. Avenant was so handsome, so amiable, and did everything with so much grace, that when he presented himself at the palace gate, the guards saluted him most respectfully, and they ran to inform the Fair with Golden Hair that Avenant, ambassador from the king, her nearest neighbour, requested to be presented to her. At the name of Avenant, the princess said, "That betokens something agreeable to me. I would wager he is a pretty fellow and pleases everybody." "Yes, in sooth, madam," exclaimed all her maids of honour. "We saw him from the loft in which we were dressing your flax, and as long as he remained under the windows we could do no work." "Very pretty," replied the Fair with Golden Hair, "amusing yourselves with looking at young men. Here, give me my grand gown of blue embroidered satin, and arrange my fair hair very tastefully. Get me some garlands of fresh flowers, my high-heeled shoes, and my fan. Let them sweep my presence chamber, and dust my throne, for I would have him declare everywhere that I am truly the Fair with Golden Hair." All her women hastened to attire her like a queen. They were in such a hurry that they ran against each other and made scarcely any progress. At length, however, the princess passed into the great gallery of mirrors to see if anything was wanting, and then ascended her throne of gold, ivory, and ebony, which emitted a perfume like balsam, and commanded her maids of honour to take their instruments and sing very softly so as not to confuse anyone. Avenant was ushered into the hall of audience. He was so struck with admiration that he has since declared frequently that he could scarcely speak. Nevertheless, he took courage and delivered his oration to perfection. He beseeched the princess that he might not have the mortification of returning without her. "Gentle Avenant," she replied, "the arguments you have adduced are all of them exceedingly good, and I assure you I should be very happy to favour you more than another. But you must know that about a month ago I was walking by the riverside with all my ladies in waiting, and in pulling off my glove in order to take some refreshment that was served me, I drew from my finger a ring, which unfortunately fell into the stream. I valued it more than my kingdom. I leave you to imagine the grief its loss occasioned me. I have made a vow never to listen to any offers of marriage if the ambassador, who proposes the husband, does not restore to me my ring. You now see, therefore, what you have to do in this matter, for though you should talk to me for a fortnight, night and day, you would never persuade me to change my mind." Avenant was much surprised at this answer. He made the princess a low bow and begged her to accept the little dog, the basket, and the scarf, but she replied that she would receive no presents and bade him go and reflect on what she had said to him. When he returned to his lodgings, he went to bed without eating any supper, and his little dog, whose name was Cabriole, would take none himself, and went and laid down beside his master. All night long Avenant never ceased sighing. "Where can I hope to find a ring that fell a month ago into a great river?" said he. "It would be folly to attempt looking for it. The princess has only named this condition to me because she knew it was impossible for me to fulfill it." And then he sighed again and was very sorrowful. Cabriole, who heard him, said, "My dear master, I entreat you not to despair of your good fortune. You are too amiable not to be happy. Let us go to the riverside as soon as it is daylight." Avenant gave him 2 little pats without saying a word, and worn out with grieving, fell asleep. Cabriole, as soon as he saw daybreak, frisked about so that he awoke Avenant and said to him, "Dress yourself, master, and let us go out." Avenant was quite willing. He arose, dressed, and descended into the garden, and from the garden strayed mechanically towards the river, on the banks of which he strolled with his hat pulled over his eyes and his arms folded, thinking only of taking his departure, when suddenly he heard himself called by his name, "Avenant! Avenant!" He looked all around him and could see nobody. He thought he was dreaming. He resumed his walk, when again the voice called, "Avenant! Avenant!" "Who calls me?" he asked. Cabriole, who was very little and was looking close down into the water, replied, "Never trust me if it not be a golden carp that I see here." Immediately the carp appeared on the surface and said to Avenant, "You saved my life in the nettle tree meadow, where I must have perished but for your assistance. I promise to do as much for you. Here, dear Avenant, here is the ring of the fair with golden hair." Avenant stooped and took the ring out of his friend the carp's mouth, whom he thanked 1,000 times. Instead of returning to his lodgings, he went directly to the palace, followed by little Cabriole, who was very glad he had induced his master to take a walk by the riverside. The princess was informed that Avenant requested to see her. "Alas, poor youth," she said, "he has come to take leave of me. He is convinced that I required an impossibility, and he is about to return with these tidings to his master." Avenant was introduced and presented her with the ring, saying, "Madam, I have obeyed your commands. Will it please you to accept the king, my master, for your husband?" When she saw her ring quite perfect, she was so astonished, that she thought she was dreaming. "Really," said she, "courteous Avenant, you must be favoured by a fairy, for by natural means this is impossible." "Madam," he answered, "I am not acquainted with any fairy, but I was very anxious to obey you." "As you are so obliging," continued she, "you must do me another service, without which I will never be married. There is a prince not far from here, named Galifron, who has taken it into his head he will make me his wife. He declared to me his determination, accompanying it by the most terrible threats, that if I refused him he would lay waste to my kingdom. But judge if I could accept him. He is a giant taller than a high tower. He eats a man as a monkey eats a chestnut, and when he goes into the country he carries in his pockets small cannons, which he uses for pistols. And when he speaks very loud, those who are near him become deaf. I sent word to him that I did not wish to marry, and that he must excuse me, but he has never ceased to persecute me. He kills all my subjects, but before anything can be done you must fight him and bring me his head." Avenant was a little astounded at this proposition. He mused for a few minutes upon it, and then answered, "Well, madam, I will fight Galifron. I believe I shall be conquered, but I will die as becomes a brave man." The princess was much surprised at his determination. She said 1,000 things to prevent his undertaking the adventure. It was of no use. He withdrew to seek for weapons and everything else he might require. When he had made his preparations, he replaced little Cabriole in his basket, mounted a fine horse, and rode into the dominions of Galifron. He inquired about him of all he met, and everyone told him he was a very demon whom nobody dared approach. The more he heard of him, the more his alarm increased. Cabriole encouraged him and said, "My dear master, while you fight him I will bite his legs. He will stoop to rid himself of me, and then you can kill him easily." Avenant admired the wit of the little dog, but he knew well enough that if his help could be of little avail. At length he arrived in the neighbourhood of Galifron's castle. All the roads to it were strewed with the bones and bodies of men whom he had eaten or torn to pieces. He did not wait long before he saw the monster coming through the wood. His head was visible above the highest trees, and he sang in a terrible voice, "Ho, bring me some babies, fat or lean, that I may crunch 'em my teeth between. I could eat so many, so many, so many, that in the wide world there would not be left any." Upon which Avenant immediately sang to the same tune, "Ho, here is Avenant to be seen, who comes to draw your teeth so keen. He's not the greatest man to view, but he's big enough to conquer you." The rhymes were not quite adapted to the music, but he made them in a great hurry, and it is really a miracle they were not much worse, for he was in a desperate fright. When Galifron heard these words, he looked about him in every direction, and caught sight of Avenant, who, sword in hand, uttered several taunts to provoke him. They were needless, however. He was in a dreadful rage, and snatching up an iron mace, he would have crushed the gentle Avenant at one blow, had not a crow alighted at that very instant on his head, and with its beak most accurately picked out both of his eyes. The blood ran down his face, and he laid about him on all sides like a madman. Avenant avoided his blows, and gave him such thrusts with his sword, running it up to the hilt in his body, that at last he fell bleeding from 1,000 wounds. Avenant quickly cut off his head, quite transported with joy at his good fortune, and the crow, who had perched itself on the nearest tree, said to him, "I have not forgotten the service you rendered me in killing the eagle which pursued me. I promised you I would return the obligation. I trust I have done so today." "I owe all to you, Monsieur Crow," replied Avenant, "and remain your obliged servant," and forthwith mounted his horse laden with the horrible head of Galifron. When he reached the city, all the people followed him, crying, "Behold the brave Avenant, who has slain the monster!" So that the princess, who heard a great uproar, and who trembled lest they should come and announce to her the death of Avenant, dared not inquire what had happened. But the next moment she saw Avenant enter, bearing the giant's head, which still impressed her with terror, although there was no longer any occasion for alarm. "Madam," said Avenant to the princess, "your enemy is dead. I trust you will no longer refuse the king, my master." "Ah, pardon me," said the fair with golden hair, "but indeed I must refuse him, unless you can find means before my departure to bring me some water from the gloomy grotto. Hard by there is a deep cavern, full 6 leagues in extent. At the mouth of it are 2 dragons, who prevent anyone from entering. Flames issue from their jaws and eyes. Inside the cavern is a deep pit, into which you must descend. It is full of toads, adders, and serpents. At the bottom of this pit there is a small cavity, through which flows the fountain of health and beauty. Some of that water I must absolutely obtain. Whatever is washed with it becomes something marvellous. If persons are handsome, they remain so forever. If ugly, they become beautiful. If young, they remain always young. If old, they become young again. You may well imagine, Avenant, that I would not quit my kingdom without some of this wonderful water." "Madam," he replied, "you are so beautiful already that this water will be quite useless to you. But I am an unfortunate ambassador, whose death you desire. I go in search of that which you covet, with the certainty that I shall never return." The fair with golden hair was immovable, and Avenant set out with the little dog Cabriole to seek in the gloomy grotto the water of beauty. Everybody who met him on the road exclaimed, "'Tis a pity to see so amiable a youth wantonly court destruction. He goes alone to the grotto, when even if he had 100 men to back him, he could not accomplish his object. Why will the princess only demand impossibilities?" Avenant passed on without saying a word, but he was in very low spirits. Having nearly got to the top of the mountain, he sat down to rest a little, allowing his horse to graze and Cabriole to run after the flies. He knew that the gloomy grotto was not far from that spot, and looked about to see if he could discover it. He perceived a horrible rock, as black as ink, out of which issued a thick smoke, and the next minute one of the dragons, casting out fire from his mouth and eyes. It had green and yellow body, great claws, and a long tail, coiled around in more than 100 folds. Cabriole saw all this, and was so frightened he did not know where to hide himself. Avenant, perfectly prepared to die, drew his sword and descended towards the cavern, with a phial which the fair with golden hair had given him to fill with the water of beauty. He said to his little dog Cabriole, "It is all over with me. I shall never be able to obtain the water which is guarded by those dragons. When I am dead, Fill the phial with my blood and carry it to the princess, that she may see what she has cost me. Then go to the king my master and tell him my sad story." As he uttered these words, he heard a voice calling, "Avenant, Avenant." "Who calls me?" he asked, and he saw an owl in the hollow of an old tree, who said to him, "You let me out of the fowler's net in which I was caught and saved my life. I promised I would do you as good a turn, and now is the time. Give me your phial. I am familiar with all the windings in the gloomy grotto. I will fetch you some of the water of beauty." Oh, I leave you to imagine who was delighted. Avenant quickly handed the phial to the owl and saw it enter the grotto without the least difficulty. In less than a quarter of an hour, the bird returned with the phial full of water and tightly stopped. Avenant was in ecstasies. He thanked the owl heartily and, reascending the mountain, joyfully took his way back to the city. He went straight to the palace and presented the phial to the fair with the golden hair, who had no longer an excuse to make. She thanked Avenant, gave orders for everything to be got ready for her departure, and finally set out with him on their journey. She found him an exceedingly agreeable companion, and said to him more than once, "If you had wished it, I would have made you king, and there would have been no occasion for us to quit my dominions." But his answer was always, "I would not be guilty of such treachery to my master for all the kingdoms on the face of the earth, although you are to me more beautiful than the sun." At length they arrived in the king's capital city, and his majesty, hearing the fair with golden hair was approaching, went to meet her and made her the most superb presents in the world. The marriage was celebrated with such great rejoicings that folks could talk of nothing else. But the fair with golden hair, who secretly loved Avenant, was never happy when he was out of her sight, and was always praising him. "But for Avenant," she would say to the king, "I should never have been here. For my sake he has done impossibilities. You should feel deeply indebted to him. He obtained for me the water of beauty. I shall never grow old, and I shall always remain handsome." The envious courtiers, who heard the queen express herself thus, said to the king, "You are not jealous, and yet you have good cause to be so. The queen is so deeply in love with Avenant that she can neither eat nor drink. She can talk of nothing but him, and of the obligations you are under to him. As if anyone else it had pleased you to send her would not have done so much." "That's quite true," said the king, "now I think of it. Let him be put in the tower, with irons on his hands and feet." Avenant was accordingly seized, and in return for his faithful service to the king, fettered hand and foot in a dungeon. He was allowed to see no one but the jailer, who threw him a morsel of black bread through a hole and gave him some water in an earthen pan. His little dog Cabriole, however, did not desert him, but came daily to console him and tell him all the news. When the fair with golden hair heard of Avenant's disgrace, she flung herself at the king's feet, and bathed in tears implored him to release Avenant from prison. But the more she entreated, the more angry the king became, for he thought to himself, "It is because she loves him," so he refused to stir in the matter. The queen ceased to urge him and fell into a deep melancholy. The king took into his head that perhaps she did not think him handsome enough. He longed to wash his face with the water of beauty, in hopes that the queen would then feel more affection for him. The phial full of this water stood on the chimney-piece in the queen's chamber. She had placed it there for the pleasure of looking at it more frequently, but one of her chambermaids, trying to kill a spider with a broom, unfortunately threw down the phial, which broke in the fall, and all the water was lost. She swept the fragments of glass away quickly, and not knowing what to do, it suddenly occurred to her that she had seen in the king's cabinet a phial precisely similar, full of water, as clear as the water of beauty. So without a word to anyone, she adroitly managed to get possession of it and placed it on the queen's chimney-piece. The water which was in the king's cabinet was used for the execution of princes and great noblemen who were condemned to die for any crime. Instead of beheading or hanging them, their faces were rubbed with this water, which had the fatal property of throwing them into a deep sleep from which they never awakened. So it happened one evening that the king took down the phial which he fancied contained the water of beauty, and rubbing the contents well over his face, he fell into a profound slumber and expired. The little dog Cabriole, who was the first to hear the news of the king's death, ran to it with Avenant, who begged him to go and find the fair with golden hair and remind her of the poor prisoner. Cabriole slipped quietly through the crowd, for there was great confusion at court in consequence of the king's death, and said to the queen, "Madam, do not forget poor Avenant." She immediately recalled to her mind all that he had suffered on her account and his extreme fidelity. She left the palace without speaking to anyone and went directly to the tower, where with her own hands she took off the irons from the hands and feet of Avenant, and putting a crown of gold upon his head and a royal mantle over his shoulders, she said, "Come, charming Avenant, I make you the king and take you for my husband." He threw himself at her feet in joy and gratitude. Everyone was delighted to have him for their master. His nuptials were the most splendid that were ever seen in all the world, and the fair with golden hair reigned long and happily with the handsome Avenant. A kindly action never failed to do. The smallest brings a blessing back to you. When Avenant preserved the carp and crow, and even had compassion on the woe of an ill-omened and ill-favoured owl, who would have dreamed a feeble fish or fowl would place him on the pinnacle of fame? When of his king he urged the tender flame, and won the fair he for another wooed, unshaken in his loyalty he stood, innocent victim of a rival's hate. When all seemed lost, when darkest frowned his fate, just Providence reversed the ruthless doom. To virtue gave the throne, to tyranny a tomb. The end.